The door to the kitchen opened before Mara could pretend she was not already awake. Her uncle did not knock. He never knocked. The door swung wide, hit the wall and bounced back halfway, and he stood in the gap with his arms folded and his eyes already moving around the room like he was taking inventory of everything inside it, including her. Mara was sitting on the edge of her cot with her hands pressed flat on her knees. She had been sitting that way for a while. The kitchen was cold in the early mornings, and the floor was stone, and she had learned a long time ago not to leave her feet dangling where the cold could reach them from below. She had a blanket across her shoulders, but she had not been sleeping. She had been listening to the house settle around her, and thinking about nothing she wanted to think about. Her uncle's name was Gerald. He was not a large man, but he carried himself like one, with his shoulders back and his chin lifted, and a particular way of filling a doorway so that the space felt smaller than it was. He had pale eyes that always looked faintly annoyed, even when he was eating, even when he laughed, which was not often. He looked at her now with those pale, annoyed eyes and said, "You're up." "Yes," she said. He came into the kitchen without being invited, which was not something she would ever have said out loud, but which she noticed, the way she noticed most things about him, quietly and without expression. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. The chair was the only one with arms. He had moved it from the main dining room 3 years ago, and no one had said anything about it. Mara stood and moved to the stove. She knew what mornings looked like in this house. She had not needed to be told what to do in the mornings for a very long time. The Pack compound had 42 rooms across 3 buildings, and she had lived in 11 of them at different points in her life. The kitchen cot was not the worst. It had its own small window, and the smell of last night's cooking was not unpleasant, and there was a door that locked from the inside. Not that Gerald ever respected the lock, but the lock existed, and that meant something, even if she was the only one who thought so. She filled the kettle and set it on the burner. She got the tin of ground coffee from the shelf, the good tin that was only to be opened for Pack members and guests and not for her, and she measured it out, because Gerald drank his first coffee of the day at a specific strength, and she had learned it years ago by trial and error, and one incident with a thrown cup that she no longer thought about. "Sit down," he said. She turned from the stove. The kettle had not boiled yet. She sat at the other end of the table, the far end, in the chair without arms, and waited. Gerald spread his hands on the table in front of him. It was a habit he had when he was about to say something he had already decided. His hands would go flat on the surface, and he would look at them for a second, and then look up, as if the table had given him permission to speak. "I have news," he said. Mara said nothing. She had learned that silence was the safest response to sentences that began that way. "Elder Voss has agreed to the arrangement," he said. She knew the name. Everyone in the Ashvale Pack knew Elder Voss. He was 63 years old, and he led the Saltmere Pack to the east, and he had 2 failed bonds on his record, both of them ending badly enough that people stopped speculating about the reasons and started just changing the subject. There had been a third match 2 years ago that had dissolved before it was formally registered. He had 4 children from various arrangements, none of whom lived with him. He was wealthy in the way that came from inheriting rather than building, and his pack respected him the way people respect someone who controls the gate to something they need. She had seen him once. She had been 14. She had been carrying a tray of glasses across the back hall of the compound, and he had been walking through with her uncle and 2 other men, and she had stepped aside and kept her eyes down, and one of the other men had said something she did not catch, and Elder Voss had laughed. It was a dry sound. Not mean exactly, but not warm. The sound of a man who found things amusing when they confirmed what he already believed. She had thought about that laugh sometimes, in the way you think about things that do not seem important when they happen, but which stay in the back of your mind anyway. Now she sat at the table, and her uncle said, "Elder Voss has agreed to the arrangement," and the laugh came back to her very clearly. "What arrangement?" she said. It was not really a question. She knew what kind of arrangement men like her uncle and men like Elder Voss made, but she said it anyway because she wanted to hear him say it plainly. "You'll be his 4th mate," Gerald said. "The bond will be registered next week. The ceremony is in 3 days. Mara looked at the kettle. It was beginning to make the low sound it made just before it boiled, a kind of hiss and tick that she had come to know the way you know the sounds of a place you have lived in too long. 3 days, she said. "It's already settled. Voss needs the registration done before the end of the month for the territory census. You'll go to Saltmere after the ceremony." "I see," she said. Gerald looked at her. She could feel it without turning her head. The particular quality of his attention when he was waiting for a reaction he could argue against. He preferred arguments to silence. Silence from her made him uneasy in a way that arguments did not. "You're 20 years old," he said, as if this were a point she had lost track of. You have no wolf form. You have no bond prospects in this pack. Voss is offering a formal arrangement with territory rights attached. You will be provided for. The kettle boiled. She stood and went to the stove and poured the water and let the coffee steep and poured it into his cup and set it in front of him and went back to her chair. She said, "Does he know about the Omega designation?" "It's been disclosed," Gerald said. Which meant yes, which meant it had been part of the transaction, which meant Elder Voss had agreed knowing she was an Omega, knowing she had no wolf form, knowing she was 20 and had never bonded, and had agreed anyway for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the debt her uncle owed him. A debt she had never been shown the number on. A debt that had apparently been measured and weighed and found to be exactly the size of one girl with no prospects and no pack standing, and a dormant bloodline that hadn't woken in 8 years of waiting. "What was the bride price?" she said. Gerald picked up his cup. "That's not your concern." Which meant he did not want to say the number out loud, which meant the number would make her feel more like a transaction than she already did, and the small mercy he was performing was his own, for himself, so he did not have to watch her hear it. She sat with her hands flat on her knees and looked at the table and said nothing else. This was Mara's life, and she had learned its shape early. She had been 12 when her parents died. The story that the pack told was that there had been a storm and the car had gone off the road on the mountain pass, and it had been an accident and a tragedy, and people had come to the compound to bring food for 2 weeks, and then stopped coming, and the food stopped, and the tragedy became a fact, and then the fact became part of the furniture of life, something that was simply there and no longer remarked upon. She did not know if that was the true story. She had been 12. She had not been in the car. She had been at home in the compound in the room she shared with another girl, a beta named Lucy who was 2 years older, and who left the pack to bond outside the territory when Mara was 15, and who had written her a letter once that Mara still had folded inside her pillowcase. The letter was mostly about Lucy's new life and her new bond, and the small house they were fixing up, and at the end it said, "I hope you are well, Mara. I think about you," and that had been the last one. She thought about that letter sometimes too. When her parents died, Gerald became her guardian. He was her father's younger brother, which made him family by blood, but not by any feeling she could identify in him when he looked at her. He had taken her in without ceremony. There had been no conversation about what would happen next, or what her position in the household would be. She had simply moved from the room with Lucy to the smaller room near the pantry, and within a week she was helping in the kitchen, and within a month, the helping had become the whole shape of her days. She had not been mistreated. That was the thing she always came back to when she tried to explain it to herself, or explain it in the way she would explain it if anyone ever asked, which they did not. She had not been beaten or starved or locked away. She had been kept, the way you keep something that belongs to you by default, that you did not choose and do not particularly value but that would be inconvenient to get rid of. She had her own corner of the kitchen building. She ate. She slept in a bed that was small but sufficient. She wore clothes that were plain but functional. She was not unhappy in the dramatic way that people imagined when they heard the word. She was simply not considered, not thought about, not asked. Her needs were met the way you meet the needs of a plant. You keep near the window because it came with the house, not because you love plants. The Omega designation had come at 14. She remembered the day clearly, because she had been expecting something different. In the Ashvale pack, like most packs of the old territory tradition, the secondary designation came between 13 and 15. When the body finished deciding what it was, betas were common, and alphas were valuable, omegas were rare, and the rarity meant different things depending on who was looking at them. The pack healer had come to the compound on a Tuesday, and there had been a brief examination, and then a form had been filled out, and the healer had left, and Gerald had looked at the form, and set it on the table with a particular kind of quiet, that she had come to understand meant he was recalibrating something in his head. She had looked at the form before he picked it back up and she had seen the word in the designation box, and she had known enough about what it meant to feel a cold shift in her chest, like a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. Omega. The healer had said that she expected Mara's wolf form to present within a year or two. It was normal for Omegas to take a little longer. The designation was clear. The bloodline markers were unmistakable, and everything would come in its own time. Everything had not come. 6 years later, at 20, Mara had no wolf form, no bond, and no prospects, and the word Omega in her designation file had turned from a rare and valuable thing into a kind of evidence that something had gone wrong. Packs in the territory whispered about Omegas with latent designations, dormant bloodlines that never woke. It was not common. It was not unheard of. It was the kind of thing that made a girl impossible to place and easy to overlook. Gerald had overlooked her with great consistency for 8 years. And now Elder Voss had agreed to the arrangement, and the arrangement was 3 days away. And Mara sat at the kitchen table in the early morning, with the stone floor cold beneath her feet, and the coffee cup empty in front of her uncle, and the kettle cooling on the stove, and she said nothing, because there was nothing she had permission to say. "You'll need to prepare," Gerald said, standing. "There are clothes being brought from the seamstress this afternoon. You'll wear what's provided." "Yes," she said. "And you'll be pleasant," he said. The word landed the way a door closes, firmly, with finality. "This is a good arrangement, Mara, better than you had any reason to expect." "Yes," she said. He took his cup to the sink, rinsed it with the efficiency of a man who does not think about small gestures, and walked out of the kitchen. The door did not close all the way behind him. It swung part way and stopped, and the gap let in the cold air from the hall, and Mara sat in the kitchen with the cold coming in, and the smell of coffee still in the air, and her hands pressed flat on her knees, and she thought about the drive. There was a road that ran along the eastern edge of the Ashvale compound. It went up into the hills, and came back down and passed through a stretch of pine forest that was very quiet in the mornings. She had walked that road so many times that she knew every bend in it, every patch where the gravel turned thin and you could see the packed dirt beneath, every place where the trees grew close enough to the road that in summer the branches made a ceiling, and in winter they made a skeleton against the gray sky. She had thought about running many times. She had thought about it seriously and practically. The way you think about problems you are trying to solve. Where would she go? What would she carry? How far could she get before Gerald reported her absence to the pack authority, and the pack authority flagged her name at the territory border crossings? An unmated Omega with a latent designation and no independent pack standing had no legal travel rights in 3 of the 5 territories. She had looked this up. She had found the relevant section of the territory compact in an old edition she'd found in the pack library, the one that everyone used for something else now. The language was old but clear. Omegas without a registered bond or a pack sponsorship letter could be returned to their origin pack by the territory authority upon request. The requesting party did not need to be a parent or a bond partner. They needed to be a pack authority representative. Gerald was the pack authority representative. She was not stupid. She had never been stupid. She had simply been, for most of her life, without options that were real enough to choose. But she thought about the road. She thought about the pine trees and the quiet and the particular quality of the cold air up there in the early mornings before anyone else was moving, when the sky was still gray-white and the birds had just started, and the whole world felt like it was waiting for something that might or might not arrive. She thought about it, and then she stood and went to the sink and washed the coffee cup and began to prepare breakfast, because it was 6:15, and the pack kitchen staff would arrive at 7, and there was bread to slice and eggs to collect from the coop, and a large pot of porridge that needed to start now if it was going to be ready in time. She was good at starting things on time. She was good at being ready. She was good at carrying plates and remembering what people liked, and keeping her face calm, and her voice even, and her thoughts to herself. She cracked the first egg into the bowl and watched the yolk settle and thought, 3 days. 3 days was not much time. 3 days was all the time there was. She whisked the eggs and turned on the burner and set the pan on the heat, and she did not look out the window at the road or think about the pine trees or the cold air, or the particular sound a woman's footsteps make when she is the only one moving in a quiet gray morning. She made breakfast. She made it well, because she did not know how to make anything badly, and the day began. The dress arrived that afternoon, carried by the seamstress's assistant, a young beta woman named Helen, who set the garment bag on the kitchen table and stood to one side with the polite discomfort of someone who has been asked to deliver something they know is not good news, but who has been paid to deliver it pleasantly anyway. Mara unzipped the bag. The dress was ivory, floor-length, with a scooped neck and long sleeves, and small fabric-covered buttons running down the back from the neck to the waist. It was a beautiful dress. That was the worst part of it, that it was genuinely a beautiful dress. That someone with taste and skill had made it, and that it fit the form of a young woman and not the transaction that had produced it. She touched the sleeve with 2 fingers. "It can be altered if needed," Helen said. The seamstress said to send word if anything needs adjustment. "It's fine," Mara said, and zipped the bag back up. Helen left. The bag sat on the kitchen table. Mara looked at it for a moment, and then moved it to the shelf in the corner where the linens were kept, behind the second shelf, where she would not have to look at it every time she turned around. That evening, the pack had its regular dinner, 32 people in the main hall, which was the main building's largest room. long tables and wooden chairs, and the smell of the food she had helped to prepare all afternoon. She served and cleared and kept her water pitcher moving, and did not meet anyone's eyes for longer than the moment required to do the job, and no one said anything to her except what they needed in terms of more bread, or less pepper, or another cup, or a clean fork. She was very good at not being seen at things like this. She had refined it over years into something almost like a skill. She moved around the edges of rooms. She timed her appearances to when she was needed, and her absences to when she was not. She listened to everything and showed nothing. She had a face that she wore in the pack house that she thought of, privately, as her serving face, which was pleasant without being inviting, and attentive without being present, and she had worn it for so many years that she sometimes forgot she had another one. She was clearing the last of the plates when she heard her name, and she stopped. 2 women at the far end of the table, a pack elder's wife and her daughter, both beta, both with the kind of comfortable certainty that came from a life in which nothing had ever taken away something they had counted on. The mother was speaking in the low voice people use when they are not trying to hide something so much as they do not care whether it is hidden or not. Poor girl, though, the mother said. Voss is not a kind man. The daughter made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, the sound of a woman who does not want to think too hard about something uncomfortable. She's lucky to have an arrangement at all, the daughter said, with her situation. The mother said. Mara set the plates down on her tray and walked out of the room and through the kitchen door and out the back and stood in the cold of the yard with the tray in her hands, and the sound of the dinner continuing faintly behind her and the stars very clear and cold overhead. She was not going to cry. She was not that kind of person, or she had stopped being that kind of person at some point. She could not remember exactly when. She stood in the yard and breathed the cold air, and looked up at the stars and thought about nothing, which was a skill she had also refined over years, the ability to make her mind go flat and quiet, like a pool of water with nothing moving in it. After a while she went back inside and finished clearing the table. She slept badly that night on her cot in the kitchen corner. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and listened to the compound settling around her, the creak and shift of old wood and stone, and thought about the word her uncle had used. Pleasant. You will be pleasant. As if pleasantness was a thing she had stored somewhere that could be produced on request. As if pleasantness was something she had ever had enough room in her life to actually practice. As if the woman who went to live in Elder Voss's pack house and became his 4th mate was someone who would need pleasantness, and not something harder and more durable than pleasantness, something she had already built inside herself out of necessity over 8 years of being kept and not considered. She was not afraid of Elder Voss. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid in the way that she had learned to be afraid, which was quietly, in her body, in the particular tightness across her ribs that she had come to recognize as her body's version of an alarm system. She did not let it rise into her face. She did not let it reach her hands. She let it sit in her chest and breathe there like something caged, and she stayed very still until it quieted. 3 days. She rolled over on her cot and faced the wall and pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes and thought very carefully about the road and the hills and the pine trees and the silence and the gray morning light and the feel of cold air on her face when she walked fast, and she held that image in her mind the way you hold a warm stone in your hands on a cold day, not because it helps, exactly, but because it is something to hold. She fell asleep just before dawn and dreamed about nothing she could remember. In the morning she made the coffee and set the kitchen to rights and went on with her day, because it was the only thing there was to do. The second day was worse than the first because on the second day people knew. Mara had not told anyone. She did not have anyone to tell, not in the way that sentence usually means. But the compound had its own nervous system, a web of looks and lowered voices and comments made just loud enough to carry. And by mid-morning on the second day she could feel the knowledge moving through the pack house the way heat moves through a building when someone lights a fire in one room. She was in the garden pulling the last of the autumn root vegetables when Nessa found her. Nessa was 18, a beta girl who worked in the laundry, and who had a quick mouth and kind eyes, and who was the closest thing Mara had to a friend, if friendship could live in the narrow space of 2 girls who occasionally talked to each other, without one of them needing something from the other first. Nessa had red hair she kept pinned up badly, and a habit of chewing the end of her braid when she was thinking, and she came around the corner of the garden wall with a basket under her arm, and stopped when she saw Mara's face. "You heard," Mara said. It was not a question. "Betty told me this morning," Nessa said, which meant everyone in the laundry knew, and probably half the kitchen by now. Betty was a pack elder's assistant who treated information the way some people treat bread. something to be shared generously and without restraint. Mara, is it true, Elder Voss? Yes, Mara said, and went back to the carrots. Nessa set her basket down and crouched next to her on the damp ground. She was the kind of person who crouched next to you. Mara had noticed this about her, the way she matched her body to yours when something was happening, even when there was nothing practical she could do. Do you want to talk about it? Nessa asked. No, Mara said. Then she said, he has 3 failed arrangements. 2, Nessa said. The third one was dissolved before it counted officially. I know, Mara said. That's what I mean. Nessa was quiet for a moment. She pulled a weed from between the carrot rows and turned it over in her hands. How much time do you have? Tomorrow is the ceremony. Tomorrow, Nessa said, very quietly. The word sat there between them like something neither of them knew what to do with. I don't know what to say, Nessa said. You don't have to say anything, Mara said. There's nothing to say. It's already settled. Gerald can't just… Gerald already did, Mara said. Which was the end of that. Nessa stayed crouched beside her for another minute, not saying anything, which Mara appreciated more than the saying. Then Nessa picked up her basket and said quietly, I'll be in the laundry all day if you want to come find me, and went. Mara stayed in the garden and finished the carrots and moved on to the parsnips and thought about nothing in particular, and the sky above the garden was very gray, and the smell of cold earth was strong, and the birds were quiet, and she worked until her hands were too cold to feel the soil properly, and then she stood and took her basket of root vegetables into the kitchen. The afternoon brought 2 things. The first was a visit from the pack healer, a man named Dr. Cole who was 60 and methodical, and who examined Mara with the brisk efficiency of someone processing paperwork rather than a person. He asked about her designation history, her wolf presentation status, her general health, and he wrote things in a small notebook, and he did not look at her face very much. He had the carefully neutral expression of someone who had been asked to do something he found professionally uncomfortable, but who had decided that professionalism was more important than his discomfort. Everything is in order, he said, which was a sentence that meant something very different to him than it did to her. He left a form on the kitchen table, registration documents for the bonding. It needed her signature. She stood at the table and looked at the line for her name and the pen lying next to it, and she thought about the sentence Gerald had said. It's already settled. She picked up the pen and signed her name. She pressed the nib hard into the paper, harder than was necessary, and her handwriting was very clear and even, and looked, she thought, like the handwriting of someone who had made a decision, even though the decision had never been hers to make. She set the pen down and pushed the form aside and went back to starting the dinner preparations because the kitchen did not care about her feelings, and the evening would come whether she was ready for it or not. The second thing was Elder Voss. She did not expect him. She was standing at the stove when she heard the cars come through the compound gate, the low sound of expensive engines on the gravel drive, and she went to the kitchen window and looked out, without really thinking about it, and saw the 2 black vehicles pulled up near the front entrance, and 3 men in dark coats getting out. Voss was the middle one. She recognized him from the one time she had seen him, 8 years ago in the back hallway. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had simply grown smaller in her memory of him. He walked with a cane now, a dark wooden one, but he did not look diminished by it. He looked like a man who had decided the cane was an accessory rather than a necessity, and was wearing it accordingly. She watched him go through the front entrance with her uncle, and she let the curtain fall back and went to the stove and stirred the pot and breathed slowly. An hour later, a pack member she barely knew knocked on the kitchen door and told her that Elder Voss wished to meet her and she should come to the sitting room. The sitting room was the one the compound used for formal occasions. It had a fireplace and heavy curtains and furniture that was older than anything else in the house. Gerald was there, standing near the window. 2 of Voss's men stood near the door, which they did not need to stand near, but which they had positioned themselves next to anyway, in the way that men with a certain kind of authority like to make clear they have it. Elder Voss was in the chair by the fire, the chair with arms. She walked in and stopped a few feet from him because she did not know how far to go and no one had told her, and she was not going to walk close to a man she had not chosen without being told she had to. He looked at her. His eyes were dark and they moved over her with the calm assessment of a man who was used to evaluating things. She did not look away. She did not perform anything. She stood still and let him look, and looked back, and she kept her face at the neutral setting she had been practicing her entire life. Mara, he said. He said her name as if he had known it for a long time, which he probably had, because men like him had probably been given her full file before any of this was discussed. Elder Voss, she said. He had a low, deliberate voice, the voice of a man who did not need to speak loudly because he had never had to. "Your uncle tells me you're an able manager of a house," he said. She glanced at Gerald, who was looking at the curtains. "I keep the kitchen," she said. "That's a skill," Voss said, not warmly, factually, the way you acknowledge something that fits a category. "Yes," she said. "You'll have a full staff at Saltmere," he said. "You won't be working in the kitchen." She did not say what she thought, which was that she was not sure whether that was a gift or a removal. "I see," she said. And Voss watched her for a moment. Something moved in his eyes, something she could not name, not cruelty exactly, but the awareness of it, the awareness of the situation, and of what she was, and of the shape of things. He was not an unkind man, she thought. He was simply a man for whom other people's desires had rarely been factors he needed to calculate. "You'll be expected to present yourself well at Saltmere," he said. "The pack has a public profile, you understand." "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and reached for his cane and made a gesture that was a dismissal without being rude about it. She left the room. She walked back down the hall toward the kitchen, and she kept her pace even, and she did not look back. And she went through the kitchen door, and stood at the sink, with the cold water running over her hands, and she stood there for a long time, not washing anything, just letting the cold move over her skin. Present yourself well. She had been presenting herself well her entire life. She had been presenting herself in ways that were useful to other people, in ways that smoothed things over and did not create inconvenience, and did not draw attention to inconvenient truths. She had been managing her own presentation since she was 12 years old, and the person managing it had changed once since then, and was about to change again, and she did not know how to feel about that, so she stood at the sink and felt the cold water, and thought about nothing until the nothing was almost true. Nessa came in from the laundry with a load of folded table linens and stopped when she saw Mara standing at the sink with the water running. "He was here, wasn't he?" Nessa said. "Yes," Mara said. "How was it?" "Fine," Mara said, which was the word she used for things that were not fine but were not worth describing as anything else. Nessa set the linens on the table. She went to the stove and picked up the wooden spoon and stirred the pot that Mara had left unattended, not because it needed stirring but because she needed something to do with her hands. "You could refuse," Nessa said very quietly. "There are rules you have a right to." "Nessa," Mara said. "I'm just saying." "Nessa," she said it again, the same way. Not angry, just finished. Nessa went quiet. Mara turned off the water and dried her hands and picked up where she had left off with dinner. The rules that Nessa was talking about existed the way a lot of rules existed in the Territory Compact, which was on paper, in the right language, in the right legal structure, and also completely inaccessible to a 20-year-old Omega with no pack standing, no independent means, no registered bond, and no pack authority behind her except the one who had arranged the transaction in the first place. She could refuse. And then Gerald would report the refusal to the pack authority, and the pack authority would note that she had no legal grounds for refusal without a counterbond offer, which she did not have, or a pack-sponsored appeal, which no one would file on her behalf, and the arrangement would stand, because the arrangement was legal, and she was a pack Omega, without the standing to challenge it. She knew this. She had looked it up. She had spent a long afternoon in the pack library 3 weeks ago when she had first heard Gerald on the phone with a voice she didn't recognize, speaking in the careful tone he used for important negotiations, and she had felt something cold move through her, and had gone to the library and found the Territory Compact and read the relevant sections, and then sat for a long time with the book closed in her lap. She had not been wrong. She had almost hoped she was wrong. She turned back to the stove and the vegetables and the evening. There was a moment, after dinner, when she was passing through the back corridor carrying a stack of clean dishes to the pantry, and she passed the door that opened onto the east yard, and the door was not fully latched and the wind pushed it open just enough to let the cold night air in, and she stopped. She stood with the dishes in her hands and the cold air coming through the gap and the dark yard beyond it, and the hills beyond that, and the pine trees up there somewhere in the dark, and the road that ran between them. She stood there for a long time. The dishes were heavy, her arms were tired from the day, the night air smelled like autumn dying, the last of the cold earth smell, and the dry leaves and the faint bite of winter coming. She could not see the road from here. She could not see the trees. She could only see the dark. She pushed the door closed with her hip and it latched this time, and she went to the pantry and stacked the dishes in their places and went back to the kitchen and started on the washing up. That night she lay on her cot and she thought about her mother. She did not do this often. She had learned early that thinking about her mother in any sustained way led somewhere she did not have the luxury of going, somewhere that required space and time and privacy that she could not afford in the compound's kitchen building with its thin walls and early mornings. But that night she let herself think about her mother's hands, which she remembered very clearly, strong and quick and always moving, and the sound of her mother's voice, which she could no longer fully reconstruct, but which she remembered had a particular quality of warmth in it, the kind of warmth that does not need to announce itself. Her mother had been a fully presented Omega. Her wolf had come at 16 and it had been, by all accounts, extraordinary, a large silver-gray form with dark eyes that the pack still talked about when they thought Mara was not in earshot. Her mother had bonded with her father, who was a beta, which was unusual, and which the pack had not entirely approved of, and which her parents had done anyway, together, as if pack approval was a consideration they had already weighed and found insufficient. Mara thought about that. She thought about what it would take to weigh pack approval and find it insufficient. She thought about her father, whom she remembered less clearly than her mother, who had been a quiet man with an easy laugh and hands that smelled like wood because he had worked in the compound's carpentry shop, and who had, the few times she had seen him angry, gone very still rather than loud. She thought about her parents and the road they had not taken on the mountain pass. She thought about the wolf that had never come for her, and the bloodline her healer had called unmistakable and dormant. And she thought about the way the word dormant sounded, not dead, not gone, just sleeping, just waiting for something she apparently did not have. She thought about Elder Voss saying, "Present yourself well." And she thought about her mother's wolf, silver-gray and extraordinary, running through a dark forest at speed with no one's permission, and no one's arrangement, and no one's idea of what she ought to be. She rolled over and faced the wall. In the morning she would put on the dress. In the morning the cars would come and she would get into one of them, and she would go to the great hall at the edge of the compound and she would stand at the altar, and the ceremony would happen, and it would be done, and that would be that. She had promised herself she would not cry, not because she thought crying was weakness, but because she thought crying in front of Gerald was something she refused to give him, a small hard refusal that was the only thing she had full rights over in this entire situation. She kept that thought close. She held it the way she held warm stones in cold weather. Tomorrow, she thought, and closed her eyes and lay in the dark and listened to the compound settle around her, and waited for the morning that was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. She was not ready, and she went to sleep anyway. 3 hours before dawn she woke with her heart beating very fast and a feeling in her chest like something trying to get out, and she lay there with it for a long time, breathing slowly and evenly, the way the healer had told her to breathe when the chest tightness came, which it had done ever since she was 14, and which she had never told anyone about, because she did not want it noted in her file. After a while her heartbeat slowed. She lay in the dark and thought about nothing. In a few hours she would put on the ivory dress with the covered buttons and get into a car and become someone's fourth mate, and she would go on living the way she had always lived, which was quietly, and carefully, and without being asked. She was very good at living that way. She was so good at it that sometimes she was afraid it was the only way she knew. The dark stayed dark. The compound stayed quiet. Somewhere outside the kitchen window, a single bird started calling, which meant it was almost 4 in the morning, and the night was almost done. She listened to the bird and breathed and waited. She walked into the forest alone the night before the ceremony. She told herself she was just getting air. She told herself it was the kind of thing anyone would do, the night before something. Just a walk, just the road, just the trees. She told herself this while she put on her coat over her sleeping clothes and tied her boots with neat double knots and went out the back of the kitchen building very quietly, past the door that had opened onto the east yard, which she had closed and latched very carefully the night before. She walked. The road ran east and then north, past the edge of the compound fence, past the storage buildings, past the old barn that was no longer used, and then up into the first fold of the hills where the pine trees started. She had walked it so many times that her feet knew it even in the dark. The moon was partial tonight, enough to see by if you knew where you were going, which she did. The cold was sharp. It went straight through her coat and found the skin beneath, and she pulled the collar up and kept moving, and the cold was not unpleasant exactly. It was clear. It was honest in a way that the inside of the compound was not, where everything was regulated and managed and kept within understood limits. She was not going to run. She had made this decision clearly and logically 2 days ago when she had first sat at the kitchen table and heard the word arrangement, and she had come back to it every time her mind wandered toward the road, and the trees, and the dark, and the fact that she had a pair of boots on her feet and 2 working legs, and a body that was 20 years old, and entirely capable of moving fast if given a reason. She was not going to run, because there was nowhere to go that his hand could not reach. She had checked this. She had been thorough. She walked. The hill rose and the trees thickened on either side, and the sound of the compound fell away, and the sound of the forest took its place, which was not silence but something close to it, the small sounds of night creatures and the wind in the upper branches and the creak of wood settling in the cold. She had always liked this particular quality of sound. It was the kind of sound that did not require anything of you. It simply existed and you could walk through it, and it would close behind you like water. She reached the border tree. It was an old pine, much older than most of the others on the hill, with a trunk as wide as two of her, and bark that had split and ridged over years into something that looked like a map of somewhere she had never been. And she had found it when she was 9, before everything, when she had still been the kind of child who went looking for things without knowing what she was looking for. She had climbed it that first time and sat in the high branches and looked out over the valley and the compound below and felt, for a minute, that she was somewhere else entirely. She had come back to it many times. She had not climbed it in years. She put her hand on the bark now and felt the ridged surface under her palm, and looked up into the dark branches, and thought about being 9, and thought about the valley below and the compound that was also below, two things at different distances. She sat down at the base of the tree, which she had also not done in years. The ground was cold and slightly damp through her coat, and she didn't care. She put her back against the trunk and looked out through the gap in the trees where the hill dropped away, and you could see, if the night was clear enough, the lights of the valley and the dark shapes of the buildings below. She could see them. The compound lights were on, a few of them, the security lights that never went off, and the light in Gerald's study window, which was always on late, and the kitchen light, which was always on early, and would be on now, and would be on tomorrow morning without her in it, for the first time in 8 years. She thought about that. She thought about the stove and the kettle and the tin of good coffee that was only for pack members, and the chair with arms that Gerald had brought from the main dining room, and she thought about the line of the kitchen window she had looked out of so many times that she knew every variation of light it could hold, the early gray light and the bright winter light, and the particular warm quality of the autumn afternoon light that came through it at an angle she had learned to anticipate. She would not see that window tomorrow. She would be in Elder Voss's pack house at Saltmere, which was larger, she had been told, and which had a view of the eastern mountains, and which she had never seen, and which she would now be expected to call home. She thought about the word home. She had thought about it before and come to the conclusion that the word had never quite applied to the kitchen of the Ashvale compound, but that some small part of her had attached the word to it anyway, the way you attach a word to a thing because you don't have another word that fits, and the silence where a word should be is its own kind of pain. She sat against the old pine tree and looked at the compound lights below, and she was not crying. She had promised herself she would not cry, and she was keeping that promise, though she acknowledged, very quietly and only to herself, that the thing in her chest right now was the cousin of crying, its logical neighbor, something that sat exactly where tears would sit if she let them. She did not let them. She let the thing sit there in its place, and she breathed cold air and looked at the lights below and said, very quietly, out loud, to no one, "I will remember this." Not the compound, not the kitchen, not Gerald and his chair with arms and his pale annoyed eyes. She meant the tree. She meant the road. She meant the feeling of walking up here alone in the cold and the dark, which was, she realized, the freest she had ever been. The freest she had been since the last time she was here, which was years ago now, and perhaps the freest she would be for a long time. She wanted to mark it. She wanted to make it real, in a way that would stay real after she left. She sat for a long time. She did not count the minutes. The cold worked into her and she sat in it, and the forest made its quiet sounds and the moon moved a little and the compound light stayed on below. She thought about her parents on this hill. Her mother had told her once that she had found this tree too, when she was young, before she bonded, before the pack, before any of it. She had not said much about it. She had said, "There is a tree up on the east hill that is older than all of us put together, and when I was afraid of something, I used to go and put my hand on it, and let it be older and larger than my fear." Mara thought about that. She put both hands flat on the bark behind her. She did not know if it helped. She thought maybe it did, a little. Not in any way she could explain, but in the way that very old things sometimes help when you put yourself close to them and let them be larger than you. She sat until she was very cold, and then she stood, slowly, because her legs had stiffened, and she turned and looked at the tree for a moment, the whole of it, the wide, dark shape of it against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. "Okay," she said. To the tree, or to herself, she was not sure. Okay. She walked back down the hill. The road was exactly as she had left it, which was a stupid thought but which she had. The road is exactly as I left it. Because she had expected something to have changed, something in herself or in the world, some shift that would make the walk back feel different from the walk up. Nothing had changed. She reached the compound fence and walked along it to the gate, and the gate code was what it had always been, and she let herself in and latched it behind her, and walked across the east yard and in through the kitchen back door, and locked it behind her, and took off her boots and set them by the door and hung up her coat and went to her cot. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling. In a few hours she would put on the dress. The dress was still on the shelf behind the linens, in its bag, waiting with the patience of an object that has no feeling about what it is meant for. She thought about her mother's voice. She could not reconstruct it anymore, not the exact quality of it, but she remembered the shape of it, the cadence, the way certain words had sounded in it. She thought about the tree. She thought about the road. She thought about Nessa, who would probably cry at the ceremony, quietly and to one side, the way Nessa cried about things, which Mara had seen once when Nessa's younger brother left the pack to take a bond in the north, and Nessa had come into the kitchen and sat down and put her face in her hands for about 30 seconds, and then stood up and splashed water on her face and gone back to work. It was not weakness. It was just a very efficient grief, the kind that knew how long it could afford and stayed exactly within that limit. Mara thought she and Nessa were not so different in that way. She closed her eyes. She thought about nothing, which was the skill, and she worked at it, and after a while it was almost true. When she woke, the kitchen window was turning gray with early light, and she could smell the cold coming through the cracks in the wall, and she lay still for a moment and thought, today. Then she got up. She made the coffee, because the body knows its habits, even when the mind is not fully participating. She measured and poured and waited, and the kettle boiled and she poured, and the smell rose in the kitchen, and she drank 1 cup standing at the sink looking out the window at the gray yard and the gray sky, and the last dark edge of the hills to the east. She washed her face and braided her hair, which was dark and long, and which she usually kept in a plain braid at the back of her neck. She put on the dress. The buttons went up her back and she could reach most of them herself, the ones below the waist, but the ones above she could not, and she stood in the middle of the kitchen and thought about this for a moment and then went to find Nessa. Nessa was in the laundry building, which opened early. She was sorting sheets when Mara came in with the back of her dress half buttoned, and she stopped and looked at Mara for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Turn around." Mara turned around. Nessa buttoned the dress, all the way up, very carefully, and when she was done she put both hands lightly on Mara's shoulders for a second. Not a hug, not exactly, but something in the neighborhood of one. "You look lovely," Nessa said. "Please don't," Mara said. "I know," Nessa said. "I know. But you do." Mara turned and looked at her friend. Nessa's eyes were bright, and she had the look of someone working very hard not to say things she knew were not useful to say, which meant she was saying all of them anyway, just with her face. "None of that," Mara said gently. "None of it." Nessa agreed, and wiped quickly at one eye with the back of her hand. "Right. None of it." They stood in the laundry in the early morning, and the sheets were in their piles, and the light was getting stronger through the high window, and the compound was waking up around them, feet on gravel, and voices, and the distant sound of the kitchen staff arriving, and Mara thought, "This is the last morning I will stand here." She did not say it. It would not have helped to say it. She said, instead, "Will you come to the hall?" "Of course," Nessa said. "Where else would I be?" They stood together for a moment more, and then Mara said she needed to go, and Nessa said yes, and Mara walked out of the laundry and across the yard toward the main compound building where Gerald was already waiting by the front entrance, standing straight in his formal coat, looking at his watch. He looked up when she came around the corner. He looked at her face, and then at the dress, and then at her face again. "Good," he said. "The cars are coming at 10. It was 9:15. Mara stood in the yard with 45 minutes between her and the ceremony, and she put her hands in a loose fold in front of her, and stood very still, and thought about nothing, and waited. The cars came at 10. There were 2 of them, black with the Saltmere pack insignia on the side. Voss was already at the Great Hall. She was to be brought after. The driver was a man she had never met, who opened the back door and stepped aside, and she got in without speaking, and the door closed behind her, and the car rolled out through the compound gate and down the road. She watched the gate pass the window. She watched the road straighten, and the compound fall away behind her, and the trees come up on either side, and she looked at the trees as they passed, and she thought about last night and the border pine, and both hands flat on the bark. The Great Hall was 20 minutes from the compound. She knew the drive. She had made it once before, for a pack ceremony 2 years ago that she had served at. The hall was old stone, older than everything else in the territory, and people had been holding ceremonies there for generations, because the old law said certain things had to be done in certain places, and this was one of those places. She thought about that as the car moved through the morning. Old laws, very old laws. She thought about the territory compact and the words she had read in the library, the sections about Omega rights and pack obligations, and the Compact of Kings, which was the oldest part of the document, the part that predated most of the territorial arrangements, and which she had read carefully, and which had interested her in an abstract way, because it spoke of bloodlines and terms that the newer sections of the compact did not use. Older terms, the language of something that had been agreed to long before packs were what they were now. She had not thought about those sections since she read them. She thought about them now, briefly, for no reason she could name, looking out the car window at the trees going by. The car turned off the main road and onto the lane that led to the Great Hall. She could see the building through the trees. It was exactly as she remembered it. Gray stone and narrow windows and the old iron lanterns at the entrance that were always lit, even in the daytime, because that was the custom, and the custom had not changed. There were other cars already in the lane, say more cars than she had expected. She looked at them. Black cars and gray cars and one or two in colors that she recognized from other packs. Saltmere's vehicles, Ashvale's, and at the back of the line, blocking the furthest stretch of the lane, 2 large black vehicles that were larger than all the others, and which had no pack insignia on their sides, and which had a particular quality about them, a stillness, that made her pay attention to them, even as the car she was in moved past. She looked at those 2 vehicles as her car rolled past them. They had a seal on the door, not a pack seal, not a territory badge, something older and singular, a design she had seen before, in old documents, in the formal registers in the pack library. She looked at it as the car passed, and then the car was passed, and she was facing forward, and the entrance to the Great Hall was ahead of her, and the driver was pulling to a stop, and the ceremony was about to begin. She thought about the seal for a moment. She could not quite place it. She knew it. She had seen it. It was at the edge of recognition. She did not let herself follow the thought. The car had stopped. The door was opening. She had a ceremony to walk into. She got out of the car and stood in the cool morning air, and straightened the dress, and felt the cold stone of the entrance path under her shoes, and walked forward through the iron lantern doors and into the Great Hall. The hall was full. She had not expected this many people. The Ashvale ceremony invitations had gone to perhaps 30 guests, and she had thought, 30 people in a stone hall, that is what this is. But the hall held more than 30. The hall held closer to 100. Packs from 3 territories who had traveled, she realized, not for her, not for this, but because Elder Voss's arrangements were always political events, and this one was connected to a debt that several packs had an interest in seeing settled. All of them looked at her as she came in. She walked toward the altar, and she kept her face on the neutral setting and her hands steady, and she looked straight ahead. Elder Voss was already at the altar. He was standing very straight with his cane beside him, which was being held by one of his men. The officiant stood between them. There was a space to the left of Voss where she was to stand. She was halfway down the aisle when the hall doors opened again behind her. She did not turn around. She was taught not to turn around in a ceremony. You walk to the altar and you face forward, and that is what you do. But the hall changed. She felt it before she heard it, a shift in the air, in the quality of attention in the room, the way 100 people all turning their heads at the same moment creates a kind of pressure you can feel on your skin. And then she heard the sound of footsteps, a single set, unhurried, moving at the pace of a person who has never needed to hurry because things waited for them. And then a voice. It was a quiet voice. That was the first thing. It was not raised. It did not shout or announce or perform. It simply said, into the changed air of the hall, with the particular quality of a voice that had never had to compete for a room, because rooms had always been quiet when it spoke. This ceremony will stop. Mara stopped walking. The hall had gone so quiet that she could hear the iron lanterns burning at the entrance. She stood in the middle of the aisle, halfway to the altar, in the ivory dress with the covered buttons that she had not been able to fasten herself, and she did not turn around, and she waited. The Great Hall at the edge of the Ashvale territory had stood for 300 years. The stone of its walls had absorbed the sounds of 200 years of pack ceremonies, Every formal bond and dispute hearing and territorial agreement that the old law required to happen in that specific place at that specific weight of occasion. The walls were thick enough that noise from outside did not enter, and sound inside did not escape. It was a room built to hold things inside it, and to mean what happened there. Mara stood in the center of the aisle, and the hall held the silence in the way it had held everything else for 3 centuries. She heard footsteps. They were even and steady, and moved at the pace of someone who had already decided the outcome of everything that was about to happen, and saw no reason for urgency. They came from behind her, from the direction of the doors she had entered through, and they moved past the first row of benches and the second, and they did not slow as they came down the center of the hall toward the altar. She still did not turn around. She did not know exactly why. Some part of her knew that turning around would be a response, that it would mean she had been startled, that it would give something away that she did not want to give. So she stood with her back to the voice and her face toward the altar, and she waited, and the footsteps reached her and passed her without stopping, and a man walked past her and continued to the front of the hall. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered with her side vision, the peripheral snapshot of him as he passed her. Tall, in a dark coat, not the kind of coat pack members wore to formal events, something simpler than that, which was its own statement if you knew how to read it. He walked to the center point between Mara and the altar, and he stopped, and he turned to face Elder Voss and the officiant with his hands behind his back. Mara turned around. The man was perhaps 30 years old, or a few years past it. His hair was dark and his face was lean, and he had the kind of stillness that is not the absence of movement so much as the decision not to need it. He was not doing anything dramatic. He was simply standing there, between Mara and the altar, in the middle of a ceremony that was already in progress, as if standing in the middle of other people's ceremonies was a thing he was entirely comfortable doing. Elder Voss had gone very still at the altar. His face had not changed exactly, but his eyes had changed, and she could see it even from where she stood, the particular adjustment that happens to a person's eyes when they encounter something they had not factored into their planning. "Calum," Voss said. One word. It landed in the silence of the hall like a stone into still water. The man at the center of the hall said nothing for a moment. He did not seem in any rush to respond. Then he said, "Elder Voss," with the careful courtesy of someone who is being polite specifically because it makes what comes next more pointed. She knew the name. She knew it the way everyone in the territory knew it, which was from a distance, from documents and spoken references and the kind of awareness you have of something very large that operates at a level your own life rarely intersects with. Elam was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. He was not a legend exactly, because legends were distant and he was known to be real and present, but he occupied a category of person that most people in the Ashvale Pack experienced only through the laws he governed and the decisions he made, and the authority his position held over every pack in 5 territories. And he was not supposed to be here. She looked at the 100 people in the hall and saw, in their faces, the same understanding registering. He was not supposed to be here. There was no protocol for this, no ceremony that invited the Alpha King's presence, no formal expectation that he attended the bonding ceremonies of minor pack arrangements in secondary territory compounds. He was here. That was all any of them had, and the hall was full of people trying to understand what that meant and coming up with nothing satisfying. Calum looked at the officiant and said, "I need to speak before you proceed." The officiant was an elderly man named Reverend March, who had been performing pack ceremonies for 40 years and who was almost certainly the most experienced person in this hall at managing unexpected developments at formal events. He looked at Calum with an expression of careful neutrality and said, "Of course, my lord." Calum turned then, not to Voss, not to the officiant. He turned to look at the hall, and his gaze moved across the assembled packs with a clarity that was not aggressive but was very much present. The gaze of a man who sees everything he is looking at and makes no effort to hide that he does. Then he looked at Mara. She stood in the aisle in her ivory dress and looked back at him. "What is your name?" he said. It was a different thing to be spoken to directly in the middle of 100 people all watching you. She had been looked at and moved around and managed and arranged her whole life, but being spoken to directly, as if her answer was the specific thing needed, was not an experience she had often. "Mara," she said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful for that. "Mara, of the Ashvale Pack," he said. Omega designation, unregistered bond, dormant bloodline. He said it very plainly and she thought, he has a file. Of course he has a file. A man in his position would have files on every person whose situation intersected with his authority, and her situation had apparently intersected with his authority. She said yes. He turned back to the hall and he said, in the same quiet voice that required no volume to fill the space, "Under the Compact of Kings, Article 4, Section 9, the throne holds first claim on any unbonded omega of a registered primary bloodline within the 5 territories. The claim must be invoked within 6 days of a bond registration filing." He paused for just a moment. "The filing for this arrangement was registered 6 days ago." She heard, somewhere in the hall behind her, a very small sound, someone exhaling. Voss said, "The filing was registered. It is within the legal window." "You are correct," Calum said. "The window closes at midnight tonight. I am invoking the claim now, before this ceremony proceeds, which is within the lawful period." The hall did not move. It was an extraordinary quality of stillness. 100 people all trying to process information very quickly, and finding that the processing was not keeping up with events. Gerald was somewhere in the hall. She knew this because he had come ahead in one of the other cars. She could not see him from where she was standing, and she did not look for him. Looking for him would have required energy she was saving for other things. "The claim," Voss said, and the 2 words came out with a particular quality, careful and very controlled, "requires the party to be present at the registration filing." "The filing was 6 days ago in this territory. My lord was not. The claim requires the king or his appointed representative," Calum said. "My representative filed the paperwork at the territory registry at 7 this morning." Another silence. Voss put his hand on his cane, which his man had given back to him. He held it and did not speak. The officiant said, very carefully, "Do you have the documentation, my lord?" One of the men who had come in with Calum came forward and placed a folder on the altar table. The officiant opened it. The hall waited. The officiant read for a moment, and then closed the folder and said, in the tone of a man who is being professionally neutral about something he finds remarkable, "The documentation is in order." Voss said, "This is legally settled," Calum said, not unkindly, not warmly, as a fact. The hall was so quiet that when the iron lanterns at the entrance made a small sound in their brackets, everyone heard it. Mara stood in the aisle in her ivory dress and she thought, "I read the compact. I read Article 4. I read Section 9. She had read it 3 weeks ago in the Pack Library, and she had thought it was interesting in the way very old legal language is interesting, as something from a time that operates by different rules than the present, something historical. She had not thought about it as applicable to her because she had not thought of herself as anything that would be applicable to. Dormant bloodline. Registered primary bloodline. She had a registered primary bloodline. Her mother had been fully presented and registered in the territory records, which meant her bloodline was in the official register, which meant Article 4 applied to her, which was a thing she had read 3 weeks ago and had not connected to herself, because she had spent 20 years being told and shown and taught, in every way except by anyone actually saying the words, that she did not apply to the relevant categories. She looked at Calum. He was already looking at her. He had not looked away from her since the moment he had asked her name. It was not a challenging look. It was not an assessing look in the way Voss's had been in the sitting room, moving over her like inventory. It was simply a direct look, the look of a person who sees you and is not performing the act of seeing you for anyone else's benefit. She thought, "He has known my name for longer than today." She did not know where the thought came from. It arrived fully formed, with the quality of a truth rather than a suspicion. Elder Voss made one more attempt. It was a legal argument about the dormancy status of her bloodline and whether a dormant designation activated the Article 4 provision or whether activation required a presented wolf form, and he made it in the voice of a man who had been in enough rooms with enough lawyers to know how to find the thin edge of an argument and press on it. Calum listened to the argument without expression. Then he said, "The provision reads primary bloodline, not active primary bloodline. The dormancy does not affect the registration status. The Territory Legal Office confirmed this interpretation this morning." "On what basis did the Territory Legal Office review this case?" Voss said. "On my request," Calum said. Another word from his mouth that settled the room. Voss fell silent. The officiant looked at the folder again and then looked at the assembled hall with the expression of a man who has officiating experience but not this specific variety of it, and he cleared his throat and said, "Given the documentation and the legal precedent, I am required to suspend this ceremony pending the formal resolution of the claim." He did not look at Voss when he said it. He looked at the middle distance, which was the professional equivalent of refusing to pick a side. Mara stood in the aisle and felt the weight of 100 people's attention and thought, what happens now? It was a genuine question. She did not have the next part of this. The compact had an article and a section, and she had read it, but she had not read it as if she were going to need it. and she was now standing in the middle of its application, and she did not know what came after the ceremony being stopped. Calum turned to her again. "You will come with me," he said, and then, a beat after, which she would think about for a long time, "if you are willing." It was such a small addition. 4 words after a sentence that was already complete without them. "If you are willing." She was standing in the middle of a legal process that had just been applied to her without her input, by a man she had never met, in a hall full of people who were looking at her, and he had added "if you are willing," as if her answer was not already decided by the documentation and the compact and the authority of his position. She thought about that for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "Yes." She did not say it loudly. She said it at the same volume she said most things, evenly and clearly, and in the very strange quiet of the hall it was heard by everyone. Calum turned to Voss and said, "You'll receive the formal documentation from the territory office tomorrow. The outstanding debt between your pack and Ashvale is a separate matter that will be directed to the appropriate legal channels." Voss's jaw tightened. She could see it from where she was standing. A small movement, controlled. The movement of a man with a great deal of experience at not showing what he felt in important rooms. He said nothing. Calum turned to the hall as a whole and said, "This event is concluded." It was the kind of sentence that required nothing after it. It was complete the way a door being closed is complete. People began to move, slowly at first, with the careful uncertainty of a crowd that does not know what the social protocol is for an event that just changed its nature entirely. And then with more confidence as the ordinary friction of 100 people deciding to leave a room took over. One of Calum's men came to where Mara was standing. He was a tall man with a careful face, and he said, very quietly, "If you're ready, my lady, we have a vehicle at the front." "My lady." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about asking what that meant exactly, the title, whether it was formal or whether it was just what they said in his household, whether it was temporary or whether it was the beginning of something she was going to need to understand. She thought about asking all of these things. Instead, she said, "I have a coat in the car." "We'll get it," he said. She looked around the hall. Nessa was near the back, near the entrance, standing to one side with the particular stillness of someone who has just watched something she cannot quite process and is waiting for her mind to catch up. She was looking at Mara. When Mara looked at her, something happened in Nessa's face. Not relief exactly, and not confusion exactly, but something between them, something that was very close to the face a person makes when they have been holding their breath for a long time and have just found out they are allowed to stop. Mara looked at her friend and thought, "I cannot go to her right now. There is not space in this moment for what that would require." So she met Nessa's eyes for a long moment, long enough to mean something, and then she looked away. Gerald was in the hall. She found him without meaning to, the way you find a person you have been watching your back around for 8 years, with a kind of peripheral awareness that has become automatic. He was standing near the wall to the left, a few rows back, with the expression he had when he was in a room where things were happening that he could not control. It was a very controlled expression, the expression of a man who has learned to look unconcerned about things that concern him deeply. He was looking at her. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. She did not have anything she needed to say to him that would have been appropriate in this place and this moment. And she had spent 8 years not saying things that were not appropriate, and this was one more. She thought about the kitchen table and the coffee, and the chair with arms. She turned away from him and walked toward the entrance of the great hall, past the rows of people still gathering themselves, past the iron lanterns burning in their brackets, toward the cold morning outside. Calum was already ahead of her, at the entrance, speaking quietly with his other man. He did not watch her walk toward him. He was not performing. He was simply managing the next thing, which was apparently what he did. She reached the entrance and the cold morning air came in and she felt it on her face, and she stood at the door for just a second before she stepped out, and she thought about the border pine up on the East Hill, both hands flat on the bark, and, okay. She stepped out into the cold morning. The black vehicles were there, the ones she had seen coming in, the ones with the seal on the door. One of Calum's men opened the rear door and she got in, and the door closed, and the leather inside was warm and quiet, and the sounds of the morning outside became muffled. She sat very straight. A minute later, Calum got in on the other side, and the vehicle began to move. The lane was narrow, and the trees were close on either side, and the vehicle moved through them with the smoothness of something very well made, and very well maintained, and she looked out the window at the trees, and thought about all the times she had walked past trees, going somewhere she had not chosen. Calum did not speak immediately. He sat with the same quality of stillness she had noticed in the hall, not absence but decision. And he looked at something in his hand, a small device, and then set it in his coat pocket. Then he said, "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question that she was not prepared for it. She looked at him, which was the first time she had looked at him from close range, directly, without a hall full of people between them, and she thought, this is the person who just stopped a ceremony in a room with 100 witnesses using a 300-year-old legal provision, and what he is asking me is, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those direct eyes, and she thought he was deciding whether to believe her. Then he said, "We have a drive of about 2 hours. If you need anything, let my man in front know." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked out his own window. The vehicle moved through the trees and turned onto the main road, and she watched the Ashvale territory fall away behind her, the familiar shapes of it, the road and the hills and the pine trees dark against the sky, and she sat very straight with her hands in her lap and breathed slowly and thought about nothing in particular. In 2 hours she would be somewhere entirely new. She would be somewhere entirely new for the first time in her life. She thought about that. She turned it over carefully. Entirely new. She had not known, until this moment, that the thought of an entirely new place could feel like something other than a removal. She had not known it could feel, even a little, like the walk up the hill to the border pine in the dark, cold and honest and strange, and something like the beginning of breathing. She looked out the window at the road and the trees and the sky, and she said nothing, and she breathed. The northern court sat at the edge of the territory, the way old buildings sit at edges, not because they were built there for convenience but because they were built there for meaning. The land dropped away on 3 sides into forested valleys that ran north for 60 miles, and the 4th side, the south, opened onto the road that came up from the lower territories in a long, slow curve. It was a building that could see everything that came toward it. Mara had looked at it through the vehicle window as they came up the road. She had thought, very large. Then, more precisely, very deliberate. The kind of large that is organized and not simply accumulated, where every added wing and extended corridor had a reason that had been thought about before the stone was laid. It was not beautiful in the way things are beautiful when they are trying to be. It was functional in a way that had outlasted fashion several times over, and was simply, now, what it was, solid and permanent, and very much present. The vehicle pulled through the gate and stopped at the main entrance, and a man came to open her door, and she got out into the cold of the northern afternoon. It was colder here than in Ashvale. The air was thinner and sharper, and it hit her face cleanly, and she stood for a second on the stone of the entrance path and breathed it in, and found that she did not mind it. She had always preferred the cold to the alternative, which was warmth that asks something of you in return. Calum came around from the other side of the vehicle. He was speaking to one of his men, something brief and practical, and the man nodded and went. Then he came to where she was standing and he said, "I'll show you your rooms," and he said it in the tone of someone who was giving her information rather than instructions, which she noticed. She followed him inside. The entrance hall was stone and high-ceilinged, and there were people in it, staff members moving with the purposeful quiet of a household that was run with care. 2 of them glanced at Mara with the careful blankness of trained professionals assessing a new situation. She looked back with the careful blankness of someone who had spent 8 years doing exactly the same thing. Calum led her through a corridor, and up 1 flight of stairs and down another corridor, to a door that he opened and held for her. The room was large. That was the first thing, and she stood in the doorway and absorbed it before she stepped through, the simple fact of the size of it. She had slept in a kitchen cot for 8 years, and before that in a small room near a pantry, and before that in a room shared with another girl, and the scale of what she was looking at required a moment. There was a bed, and a sitting area by a window, and a fireplace with a fire already laid, and a door that she assumed led to a bathroom. The window looked east, over the valley, which was beginning to go gold in the afternoon light. The walls were plain stone with a few pieces of furniture that were old and well-made and unadorned, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated anything decorative. "The staff will bring your things," Calum said. "I don't have many things," she said. "Then it will be quick," he said, without any particular weight on it. She stepped into the room and turned to face him. He was standing in the doorway, which left the choice of whether to close the door between them with her, which she noted. "I should explain," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." He came in, and she did not offer him a chair, which he did not seem to expect. He stood near the fireplace and looked at her and said, "The king's claim under the Compact of Kings is a legal hold. And it means the formal bonding process cannot proceed through any other arrangement while the claim is active. It does not mean, he paused, a careful pause, the pause of someone choosing words with attention. It does not mean you are obligated to bond with me. The claim creates a window of 1 year in which the formal bonding can take place, if both parties are willing. If the year passes without formal completion, the claim lapses. She looked at him. And if I choose not to complete the bonding? She said. Then the claim lapses, he said. You would be free to pursue other arrangements. The legal protections under the claim, another small pause, which are significant, would remain active for 6 months after lapse. She looked at him for a longer moment. She was a person who had spent a great deal of her life reading rooms and faces and the gap between what people said and what they meant, and she was trying to read him now. He was not entirely readable. Most people were more readable than they thought they were, because most people had not learned to control the small things, the quality of their attention, the set of their shoulders, the rhythm of how they breathed when they were saying something that mattered to them. He had controlled most of these things, but not all of them. She could see, around the careful neutral of his expression, the quality of someone who was saying something that mattered to him, and was making himself not show that it mattered. You didn't need to invoke it in person, she said. He looked at her. The compact says the king, or his appointed representative, she said. You had a representative file the paperwork. You could have sent a second representative to the hall. The legal outcome would have been identical. He said nothing for a moment. Yes, he said. So why did you come yourself? The question sat in the room. He looked at the fireplace for a second, not long, just a glance, the kind of glance that means you are gathering something before you speak. Then he looked back at her and he said, because I thought you had been let down by enough people doing things through representatives. She heard the sentence very clearly. She thought about the table in the kitchen, and Gerald with his hands flat, and the coffee at the specific strength and the form with the line for her signature, and the dress on the shelf behind the linens. And she thought about the word pleasant, and the word arrangement, and the word settled. She thought about the elder's wife and her daughter saying, poor girl, and lucky to have an arrangement at all, with her situation. She thought about all of this very quickly, and she kept her face at the neutral setting. That's a personal reason, she said. It is, he said. She held his gaze and he held hers, and the fire in the fireplace crackled once because fires do that. I have questions, she said. I imagine you have several, he said. How long have you known about my bloodline? 2 years, he said. Since before the arrangement was filed? Yes. You were watching my situation. Someone was watching it on my behalf, he said. It's not unusual for the court to track unregistered primary bloodlines. The compact's protections only apply if the registry is maintained, and an unregistered omega with dormant status can fall through the tracking system. Someone in my pack was supposed to register me, she said. Yes, he said. She thought about Gerald. She thought about the form in the healer's notebook. She thought about an 8-year-old piece of paperwork that had apparently never made it to the territory registry, a detail so small and administrative and so quietly consequential that she had never known to look for it, and no one had ever thought to mention it. When did you realize it had not been filed? She said. 14 months ago, he said. My registry office flagged your name when a secondary record was updated. The registration gap was identified. I had the file sent to me. And I read it, he said. She waited. It was a comprehensive file, he said after a moment. Your history, your designation, the circumstances of your situation in the pack. He stopped. I requested an update every 3 months. She absorbed this. A man she had never met had been reading files about her situation every 3 months for over a year. She thought about what those files contained, the kitchen cot, the meals she made, the morning she signed the bonding form, the ceremony arrangements. She thought about what it looked like on paper, compressed into the language of administrative reports. And when the arrangement was filed, she said, I received the notification 6 days ago, he said. I reviewed the file that evening. And you came the next morning. I came the next morning, he said. The window behind her was getting darker as the afternoon moved. The fire in the fireplace had started to catch properly, and the room was warming around them. And she stood in the middle of it, in her ivory dress with the covered buttons, and her hands in a loose fold in front of her. Why, she said. She meant, specifically. Specifically why, when you had been sent files for a year, did you come the morning after this particular one? He looked at her steadily, and she had the impression he had been asked this question in his own head a number of times already. Because the file showed a pattern, he said. And because the arrangement was legal and would proceed to completion on a fixed date, And because, he paused. And in the pause, she saw the thing he had been controlling almost perfectly. The thing around the edges of his expression that was more than administrative. Because I did not want someone else making that decision for you again. She looked at him for a long time. The fire caught fully, and the room was warm. You've made a decision for me, she said. It was not an accusation, it was a fact. I've interrupted a decision that was made without you, he said. It's not the same thing. What you do now is yours. She thought about the compact. Article 4, Section 9, the window of 1 year, if both parties are willing. She thought about the border pine, and both hands flat on the bark and, okay. I need to know what this place is, she said. Not what it looks like, what it operates like, what the expectations are. I'll answer whatever you want to know, he said. Tonight? If you want, he said. She looked at the window, the valley going dark in the east, the light fading from gold to gray the way northern light does in autumn, quickly and without ceremony. Tomorrow, she said. I think tonight I need to. She stopped. She had been about to say something about the room and the size of it, about needing to be still for a while, and she was not sure she wanted to say that to him yet. He seemed to understand without the sentence, or he was good at not requiring sentences to be finished, which was a different skill, and possibly more valuable. Tomorrow, he said, there's no urgency. You're not going anywhere. She looked at him sharply and he said, at the same moment, I mean, the situation isn't going anywhere. Not. A very small pause. Not that you couldn't leave. That's not what I meant. She thought, he makes mistakes too then, she thought. That's useful to know. I know what you meant, she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she filed carefully, and did not name. Then he said, the staff will bring dinner at 7 if you want it in your room. If you want to eat with the household, dinner is at 8 in the East Hall. The room, she said. I'll let them know, he said, and he moved toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back. My man will be in the corridor if you need anything tonight. I won't need anything tonight, she said. He'll be there anyway, Calum said, not as a condition, just as a fact. He left. The door closed behind him. She stood in the large room in the ivory dress and she listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and fade. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, which was the first time she had sat down on a bed that had this particular quality of bed, which was very good, and looked at the room around her. And it was a very large room for one person. She sat with this for a while. Then she stood and went to the window and looked out at the dark valley and the beginning of stars in the northern sky, which was a different sky than the Ashvale sky. The stars arranged in the same places, but the quality of the dark around them different. The kind of dark that only comes when you are high enough above the valley floor that the land does not compete with it. She thought about the file. 3 months of updates for 14 months. She thought about a man in a very large building somewhere reading a file about a girl in a kitchen and tracking the quiet progress of an administrative situation that was also, if you read it in the right light, the slow closing of a door. She thought about him choosing to come himself. She thought about the sentence, I did not want someone else making that decision for you again. She stood at the window for a long time. Outside, the dark settled into itself properly, the way the northern dark settled, which was completely, without the ambient light of a close-built packed compound, without the security lights and the study window, and the kitchen light that never went off. It was a full dark, the kind that required you to stand in it and adjust. She stood in it and adjusted. When dinner arrived at 7, a young woman named Petra brought it on a tray and set it on the table near the fire, and said that the Alpha King had asked her to mention, if Mara had need of anything during the night, that she should ring the bell by the door. Petra was perhaps 25, and she had the competent, friendly warmth of someone who was good at her job and pleased by it, and she looked at Mara with curious, careful eyes and said nothing more than what she needed to say. Thank you, Mara said. Of course, my lady, Petra said and left. My lady again. Mara sat at the table by the fire and ate the dinner, which was good. Not elaborate but genuinely good, the kind of food that had been made with attention. She ate all of it. She had not eaten properly since the morning before, and her body had opinions about that. Afterward she sat by the fire in the large chair near it, and she thought about what Calum had said, the 1-year window, if both parties are willing, the legal protections that would remain 6 months after lapse. She thought about the word willing. She had not been asked that word in a long time. It was an interesting word to be handed, if that's what this was. She turned it over. She was willing to eat the dinner. She was willing to sit in the chair by the fire. She was willing to look at the northern dark through the window and find it different from the Ashvale dark in a way that she did not yet have a word for. She was not willing, not yet, to name what everything else meant. There was too much to think about, and she had learned a long time ago that thinking about too many things at once produced nothing useful. You took one thing and turned it over until you understood it. Then you picked up the next one. Tonight, the thing she was turning over was simply, what is this place? Not what Calum had said about it, not the legal structure, not what the compact meant, just what it was, the quality of the air, the way the stone held the sound differently from the Ashvale compound, the fire in the fireplace, the stars in the northern sky, Petra and her careful, friendly eyes. The man in the corridor she was told would be there whether she needed him or not. She was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed most, sitting in the large chair by the fire in the room that was too large for one person. She was not afraid. She had been afraid in a quiet, held way for a long time, the kind of fear that lives in your chest and breathes there like something caged, and she looked for it now, and it was not in the same place. It was not gone. She was not naive about where she was, or who had brought her here, or what any of this meant, but it was not in the same place. She sat by the fire until it burned low, and then she went to the bed and lay down, and looked at the ceiling, which was higher than any ceiling she had ever slept under, and she thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow she would ask her questions. She had a list of them, not written down but organized in her mind with the same care she organized the kitchen schedules, the things she needed first, the things she needed second, the thing that could wait until she understood the first two. The first question was one she had already asked and he had answered. The second was about the court and its operations. The third was about what was expected of her in the day-to-day. The fourth was a question she was not sure she was ready to ask, because it required admitting something to herself first, which was that when he had said, "If you are willing," the part of her that had spent 20 years being not asked had come very quietly awake. She filed that. She closed her eyes. The northern dark outside was complete, and the fire had burned to embers, and the room was warm, and she lay in the large bed, and breathed slowly, and she let herself, just for a moment, feel the full strangeness of this, the complete departure from the shape of everything that had come before. It was frightening, that strangeness. It was also something else. She fell asleep before she could name it. The morning in the northern court came with a particular quality that Mara had not encountered before. It was not gradual. The sun in the north at this time of year arrived fully, and without announcement, and when she woke, the room was flooded with a cold, clear light that had nothing apologetic about it. She lay in the large bed for a moment, and looked at the ceiling, white light on old stone, and thought, I am somewhere entirely different. But she got up. She had nothing to wear except the ivory dress, which was not a morning dress, which was not any kind of practical thing, and she stood in her room and looked at the wardrobe against the wall and opened it and found, inside, 3 changes of clothing in a range of sizes and styles. Plain, practical, good quality. Someone had thought about this. Someone had put clothes in the wardrobe of a room where they planned to bring a person who would have nothing of her own. She put on a gray sweater and dark trousers that fit well enough, and she brushed her hair and braided it and went to the door. The man in the corridor was there. He was a different man from the night before, which meant there were at least 2 of them rotating, which she noted. He was young and had a formal bearing, and he looked at her when the door opened. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, my lady," he said. "Breakfast is in the East Hall, or I can have it brought to your room." The East Hall, she said, because she had made herself a rule a long time ago that she would not hide in rooms when she had the option to see things clearly. He led her. The East Hall was a medium-sized room off the main corridor with long windows looking east over the valley, which was brilliant now in the morning light, gold and deep green in the autumn trees below. There were 4 people at the long table when she came in, members of the court staff by the look of them, who stood when she entered and then sat again when she gestured that they didn't need to. She was not comfortable with people standing up for her. She did not know if she would ever be. Calum was not there. She noted this, and sat at one end of the table and ate the breakfast that was brought, which was eggs and bread and a dark tea she did not recognize but which was very good, and she ate with the particular quietness she always had in the mornings, not antisocial, just present without performance. At the end of breakfast a woman came in and introduced herself as Clara, who managed the household. She was perhaps 50, with a face that had seen a great deal and made peace with most of it, and she had the manner of someone who was excellent at her job, and knew it without needing to prove it. "The Alpha King asks if you're available to speak with him at 9, Clara said. "Yes," Mara said. "At 9. The same young man walked her to a room on the upper floor that had a long window and a desk and 2 chairs, and no pretension whatsoever, which was, she was starting to understand, the character of how Calum organized his space. Everything functional, nothing performed. He was standing at the window when she came in, and he turned when she entered. He was wearing darker clothes than the previous day, simpler, and he looked like a man who had also been awake for a while, and was not performing readiness. She sat in one of the chairs and he sat in the other, and she said, "I have questions." "I expected you would," he said. "What is my status here?" She said. It was the most practical question, the one that everything else hung from. "Legally, under the active claim, you are under the king's protection. You are not a prisoner, you are not obligated. The claim creates a legal shelter, which means the previous arrangement has no standing. No other arrangement can be filed while the claim is active, and your movement is unrestricted within the territory." "I can leave," she said. "Yes." "And if I leave, the protection remains active, while the claim is active," he said, "which is 1 year, and you would not." She looked at him carefully. "You would not send anyone after me?" "No," he said. The word had no hesitation in it. It was not a reassurance performed for her benefit, it was a fact he seemed to find unremarkable. She studied his face. She had been studying it since the day before, cataloging it the way she cataloged things she needed to understand, and she thought, he tells the truth as a default rather than a strategy. She had met people who told the truth strategically, when it was useful, and she knew the difference in the telling. "What do you want from this?" she said. "My they." She meant, in plain terms, not what the compact said, not what the law said. Specifically, what did he want from this situation? He looked at her for a moment. "I want to know if you're all right," he said. "What you need, what the right outcome for you looks like." "That's not an answer," she said gently. "No," he agreed. "What I want." He paused, and again she saw the careful gathering of something he was choosing to say plainly, "is to give you time and space to make a real decision, not one made under pressure, not one made because the alternative is worse. A genuine decision. And if the genuine decision is to leave," she said. "Then you leave," he said. She looked at him. "You came to a ceremony personally," she said. "You invoked a 300-year-old legal claim. You drove 2 hours to bring me here yourself. Those are not the actions of a person who is neutral about the outcome." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "they're not." "Then tell me," she said, "what you actually want." The window behind him was full of morning light, and the valley below was bright, and he sat in his chair with his hands on his knees and looked at her steadily. "I want to know if this can be something," he said. "Not a legal arrangement. Not a transaction. Something real. I don't know if it can be. I know nothing about you except what's in a file. And a file." He stopped. "A file is not a person." She sat with that. She thought about the files. The 3-month updates. 14 months. She thought about what was in them, what it looked like from the outside, the shape of her life compressed into administrative language. What did that look like to someone reading it? What had it looked like to him? "Why me?" she said. "There are other Omegas. There are other primary bloodlines in the registry. Why this specific situation?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer. She had learned already that his pauses were not the pauses of uncertainty. They were the pauses of a man who believed in saying things precisely. "Because the situation was wrong," he said, "and I was in a position to do something about it, and because," another pause, "the file. What was in it? What was in it that mattered to you?" she said. "The way you functioned," he said, "in a situation designed to keep you from functioning. The way you managed things. Kept things organized. Stayed present in a place that didn't deserve your presence." He looked at the window and then back at her. "It is not a small thing to do what you did. Most people in that situation stop trying. You didn't stop trying." She looked at him. She thought about the kitchen and the morning schedule, and the coffee at the correct strength, and the eggs and the root vegetables and the serving face and the evenings clearing plates and the years of it, all the years of it, and she had never thought of it as trying. She had thought of it as what there was to do, so she had done it. She had not thought of anyone watching it and finding it notable. "I was managing a kitchen," she said. "You were managing yourself," he said, "under sustained pressure. For a long time. That's not nothing." She did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she was not ready to handle, which was set them aside temporarily and move on. "Tell me about the court," she said. "How it works," he told her. It was a practical explanation, the kind she appreciated, not a tour guide's enthusiasm, but a series of clear facts. The court had 40 staff members in the house, and another 60 across the estate grounds. The household ran on a schedule that was more flexible than the compound had been. Meals were at set times but optional. The court had legal and administrative functions as the governing seat of the Northern Territories, which meant visiting dignitaries and formal meetings on a regular basis. As the person under the king's claim, she would be introduced at formal events in a way that was currently undefined, meaning it was her choice how she was presented, and she was not required to be present at anything. "I'm not required to be present at anything," she said. "Not until you choose to be," he said. She thought about this for a long time, longer than she usually spent on a piece of information in a conversation. "That is the strangest thing you've said to me," she said. He looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because I have spent 20 years being required to be present at whatever was needed, and not required to have any preferences about it," she said. He did not say anything to this. He let it sit. She noticed that about him, the way he did not rush to fill silence, did not reach for comfort words, did not offer the kind of hollow response that most people offered when you said something true and uncomfortable in a room. He just let it be true. She decided she liked this about him. She filed it without naming it too definitively. "What do you do in a day?" she said. He blinked, which was the first time she had seen him respond to a question with anything approaching surprise. "What I do?" "Yes. I have meetings in the morning," he said, "most of them legal or territorial administrative. In the afternoon, I review documents and receive reports from the territory wardens. In the evenings, I have dinner with whoever is at the court, which is usually the senior staff and any guests. Occasionally, I go out to the grounds." "Do you like it?" she said. He paused. It was a longer pause than the others. She thought, no one has asked him that recently. "Some of it," he said. "The administrative work is necessary, but not interesting. The territorial decisions," he considered, "those matter. They have real consequences for real people. That makes them worth doing carefully." He looked at her. "What made you ask that?" "Because the file you have on me tells you what I did," she said, "not whether I liked it. I wanted to know if you were able to see the difference." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "I think I am." "And?" she said. "And I think you're better at that distinction than most people," he said. She considered this. "I had a lot of practice separating what I did from how I felt about it," she said. "It was a survival skill." He was quiet again. Not the gathering quiet before he spoke, just the quiet of sitting with something. They talked for another hour. She asked about the territory laws, specifically the ones about Omega designation and rights, which she had read in the old compact and wanted to know had been updated. He told her about the revisions that had gone through in the past 15 years, and the ones currently under review, and he did not speak about them abstractly. He spoke about them as things that affected specific categories of people in specific ways, and she could see that he had thought about this not as policy but as consequence. She thought, he is a man who thinks about what things cost other people. She had not met many of those. At the end of the conversation, she stood and said she wanted to walk outside, to see the grounds, and he said, "Of course," and she said, "Alone," and he said, "Of course," without a pause, and she went out. The grounds were extraordinary. She had not expected extraordinary. She had expected functional, the same way the interior was functional, and there was a large portion of that, the working parts of the estate, the storage buildings and the working fields to the south. But there was also, on the eastern side, a long path that ran along the edge of the hill where the land dropped away, and she walked it, and the valley spread below her, and the sky above was that northern sky she was learning to read, enormous and very blue, with a few clouds moving fast, because at this altitude, the wind came clean and uninterrupted. She walked the length of the path and turned and walked back. She was not thinking about anything in particular, and then, she was thinking about Gerald, which she had not done since she had left the Ashvale territory the morning before. She thought about him standing near the wall in the great hall with his controlled expression, and his pale, annoyed eyes, and the particular look he had given her when she walked through the hall in the ivory dress. She did not know what he was doing now. She thought he was probably managing the fallout, talking to the pack authority, writing letters, performing the careful recalibration of a man whose arrangement had been legally removed from him. She thought he was probably not thinking about her except as a piece of the situation that had moved off the board. She thought about that and found that she felt very little about it, less than she had expected to feel. She had thought, somewhere in the past 3 days, that leaving the compound would feel like tearing something, that the part of her that had been shaped by that place would resist the removal. It did not feel like tearing. It felt like putting down something heavy that you had been carrying for so long, You had forgotten it was not part of you. She stopped on the path and looked at the valley below. The autumn trees were gold and deep red, and the kind of orange that is almost too much to look at directly. She had not seen this view before yesterday, and she was already finding it more familiar than the Ashvale compound's east window, which she had looked out of every morning for 8 years. She thought, I do not miss it. Not the kitchen or the cot or the serving face or the careful management of what she showed and didn't show. She had not had time to miss Nessa yet. That was coming. She could feel it at the edge of things. The particular absence of someone who had been a thin thread of genuine warmth in a life that had mostly been other temperatures. She would write Nessa a letter. She had not had anyone to write letters to before. She thought about Lucy, who had written one letter from her new life, with the small house and the bond and the careful kindness of it. She thought about writing a letter with that same quality, genuine and a little uncertain, trying to describe something to someone who was not there. She would write it tonight. She turned and walked back toward the court building, and the afternoon was getting cold, and the sky was starting to shift toward the pale quality it got before sunset at this latitude. And she thought about dinner at 8 in the East Hall, and whether she was going to go to the East Hall for dinner, or ask for a tray in her room. She decided on the East Hall. She decided this clearly, and then thought about why, and thought, because hiding in rooms is not who I want to be, now that I have the option not to be. It was a small decision. She was aware of that, but she had learned a long time ago that small decisions accumulated into something larger, and what they accumulated into was the shape of a person. She wanted to make decisions about her shape. She walked back into the court building and went to her room and changed from the borrowed clothes into the ivory dress because she still had nothing else formal enough for dinner, and she braided her hair carefully, and she sat by the window and watched the last of the autumn light go from gold to gray in the valley below. At 8 she went down to the East Hall. Calum was there, and 4 other people who were introduced as senior court staff. They rose when she came in, which she was still not comfortable with. She sat and dinner was served, and the conversation was careful and intelligent and included her in a way that was not pointed or performed, the way good hosts include people, as if her participation was simply expected and valued rather than a special accommodation. She ate and listened and spoke when she had something to add, and twice she added something that made the conversation go in a better direction, and she felt the small, strange pleasure of that, the thing that had been available to her in the compound only in the narrow form of making the correct strength coffee, contributing to something, from a position where the contribution was wanted. After dinner, she found herself walking with Calum toward the door, and she said, "Can I ask you something that isn't practical?" He looked at her. "Yes." "When you read the file," she said, "was there something specific? A specific thing that made you put it on the priority list?" He stopped walking. They were in the corridor, and the lamps were on, and the stone was warm in their light, and he looked at her with the direct, honest eyes she had been cataloging. "There was a note in the file," he said, "from the healer, in your original designation report, about your wolf." She had not expected the wolf. She had expected something administrative. "What did it say?" she said. "That the wolf had been observed twice by the healer," he said. "Once at 14 during the designation assessment. The bloodline markers were." He paused. The healer's word was extraordinary. "And once at 17 during a follow-up examination. The healer noted that the wolf was present but had not presented. That it was," another pause, "that it was choosing to wait." Mara stood in the corridor. Choosing to wait. She had not known this. She had known about the dormant status, the latent designation, the wolf that had not come. She had not known there was a notation in her healer's file that used the word choosing. A wolf that was choosing. She looked at the wall across the corridor. The stone was old, and the lamplight made a warm orange gold on it. "I didn't know that was in the file," she said. "I thought you might not," he said. She thought about 8 years of waiting for something to arrive. She thought about the border pine and both hands flat on the bark and, okay. She thought about lying on the kitchen cot and staring at the ceiling and the thing in her chest that was the cousin of crying, and the flat quiet she made in her mind to survive mornings. She thought about a wolf that was choosing to wait. She said, very quietly, "I wonder what it was waiting for." He looked at her and did not answer, which was the correct response, and she appreciated it. And she looked at the old stone wall and the warm light and thought, "I wonder." She went to her room, and she did not sleep for a long time. She sat in the chair by the window in the dark and looked at the stars in the northern sky, and she thought about everything that had happened in 3 days, the beginning and the middle, and the place she was now, which was not the end of anything but the first day of something she did not yet have a name for. The wolf was choosing to wait. She pressed her hand flat on the cold glass of the window the way she had pressed it flat on the bark of the old pine tree on the hill above the Ashvale compound. "Okay," she said, quietly, to herself, or to the wolf, or to the northern sky. "I'm listening now." The stars were very clear. She sat with them until she was ready to sleep, and then she went to bed in the large room in the building that was very old and very deliberate and very much present, and she slept, and she did not dream about the compound. She dreamed about the forest. The northern court had seasons, the way arguments have seasons, not gently but with full commitment to each one. By the third week of Mara's stay, the autumn had hardened into something that was not yet winter but was clearly practicing. The trees below the valley had finished their gold and red and were down to the bare structure of themselves, which she found she preferred. She had always liked the honesty of winter trees. They showed you exactly what they were built from. She had settled into the court in a way that surprised her, which was not smoothly, and not without friction, but with a certain steadiness that she recognized as her own style of adaptation. She learned the building the way she had learned the compound, which was by walking through it at different times of day, until she knew what it sounded like at each hour, and what the light did at each angle, and where the staff kept things, and which corridors had drafts, which she was good at learning buildings. The staff had found their way to treating her in a manner that was careful without being cold. Petra, who brought her meals, had graduated to small conversations. Clara, who managed the household, gave her information when she asked, and did not offer it when she didn't, which Mara found respectful. The young man in the corridor changed at 6 and 12 and 6, and she had learned the names of 2 of them. She met with Calum every morning. Sometimes it was a real conversation, and sometimes it was a brief exchange about practical things, and sometimes it was simply the fact of being in the same room with someone who did not require you to manage yourself around them. She was learning the difference between his silences, the gathering silence, when he was choosing words, the settled silence, when he was comfortable, the careful silence, when she had said something that landed in him and he was feeling it before responding. She liked the careful one best. It meant she was getting somewhere true. She had written Nessa a letter and received a letter back within 5 days, which meant Nessa had written her response the day Mara's arrived and sent it immediately, which was very Nessa. The letter was 3 pages long and described the aftermath of the ceremony with a directness that made Mara press her hand over her mouth to keep in the sound that wanted to come out. Not sadness, not crying, something closer to the surprised exhale of someone who has been holding a difficult thing and is suddenly allowed to put it down. Nessa wrote, "Gerald has been very quiet since that morning. The kind of quiet that means something is happening underneath it that he is not ready to say. Betty says, the PAC authority was notified of the legal claim resolution, and the debt is being restructured through the Territory Legal Office. The bride price has been returned because there was no completed ceremony. I do not know what that means for the specific debt number, which you never found out, and which I found out was significant, the kind of significant that changes what we understood about Gerald's motivations." Mara read the letter in her room by the window and thought about the specific debt number. She thought about arrangements and transactions and the bride price she had never been told. She thought about a number large enough that it reorganized understanding of things. She wrote Nessa back, "I am not surprised. Tell me more when you know more. Also, I am all right. That is not a performed all right. That is an actual one." Nessa wrote back, "I can hear the difference even on paper. I'm glad." The 4th week brought a territorial delegation from the Western PACs, which required the court to operate in its formal capacity, which meant meetings and dinners and a schedule that Calum managed with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times. He had explained to Mara at the beginning of the week that she was not required to attend anything. He had also said, without making it into anything more than a practical matter, that if she wanted to be introduced, it could be arranged in whatever form she preferred. She thought about this for 2 days. Then she went to his office and said, "I want to be present at the formal dinner on Thursday." He looked up from the document he was reading. "All right. I want to be introduced as Mara of the Northern Court," she said, "not as the Omega under the King's claim or any variation of that. Just my name and that I am a member of the household." He looked at her. "That's a reasonable request. Is it complicated?" "No," he said. "It is exactly what will happen." She had not expected it to be simple. She had spent 20 years in a situation where simple things were made complicated when they involved her preferences. She sat with the simplicity of this for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me for this," he said. "I know," she said. "I still do." He looked at her with something in his face that she had gotten better at reading, which was a quality of attention that was not professional but personal. The difference in his eyes when he was looking at a situation versus looking at her. "How are you finding it here?" he said. "Not the practical things, actually." She looked out his window at the valley. It was gray today, low clouds moving fast, the kind of day that felt like thinking. "I have too much space," she said. He waited. "I don't mean the rooms," she said. "I mean," she considered the right way to put it, "I have spent 20 years in a situation where everything I did was dictated by what was needed, what food, what time, what face to wear, where to be. And here I wake up and there is a gap. Where all of that used to be." She looked back at him. "I am not complaining. I understand the gap is freedom. I just haven't learned yet what to fill it with." He nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable observation about something that most people would be expected to just be grateful for." "I am grateful," she said. "That's not the same as knowing what to do with it." "No," he agreed. "What did you do?" she said. "When you were given authority you hadn't had before. The first time, when you were still learning what to do with it." He looked at the window. She had asked him a personal question, and she was watching to see if he would answer it in kind or redirect to the political version of it. "I made decisions I wasn't ready for," he said. "Some of them wrong. And I paid attention to which ones were wrong and why. And after a while, the gap between the decision and the readiness got smaller." He looked back at her. "It's a slower process than anyone tells you." "Did anyone help you?" she said. "My father," he said, "until he died. And then a man named Porter, who was my senior advisor for 12 years. He retired 2 years ago." She thought about this. "Do you have someone now?" "I have several good advisors," he said. "It's not the same. Porter had." He stopped. "Porter would say things to me that no advisor says, because the relationship was old enough that the cost of truth was lower than the cost of management." "You miss that," she said. He looked at her directly. "Yes." She thought about Nessa. She thought about the 3-page letter, and the swift response, and the quality of a relationship that was old enough that truth cost less than management. She thought about what it would take to have that with a person who was not Nessa. "I can be honest with you," she said. "If that's useful, I am not very good at management." He looked at her with the careful attention that was not professional. "I've noticed," he said, and there was something in it that was not quite a smile, but was what a smile sounds like in a voice. The dinner on Thursday was the first formal event she had attended in the Northern Court. She wore the only dress she owned, which was the ivory one, and she stood in her room and looked at it, and thought about putting it on, and thought about the morning 3 weeks ago, when she had buttoned the back of it herself in the kitchen corner, and had not been able to reach the top buttons, and had gone to find Nessa in the laundry, and Nessa had said, "Turn around." She put the dress on and did the buttons herself, the ones below the waist, and left the ones above because she had decided she was going to walk to the dinner like that and see what happened. What happened was, Petra, who was in the corridor when Mara came out of her room, and who looked at the half-buttoned dress and said, "Would you like a hand?" without any significance attached to it, just the practical question. "Yes," Mara said. Petra did the buttons, all the way up, with quick, neat fingers, and said, "You look lovely," and then looked at Mara's face and said, I know, none of that." Which meant that in 3 weeks Mara's response to that particular sentiment had communicated itself clearly enough to be anticipated. "None of it," Mara agreed. The dinner was in the main hall, which she had not been to since arriving. It was larger than she expected, set for 30. All of them the Western delegation, and Calem's senior court staff and Mara. At one end of the table, near 2 women, who were part of the Western PAC's administrative team, and who turned out to be intelligent and direct, and with whom she had, over the course of an hour, the best conversation she had had in some years. She was introduced as Calem had promised, Mara of the Northern Court. Nothing else, no designation, no status, no legal context, just a name and a place. She sat with this and thought, this is what it feels like to be introduced without being explained. She looked, once, across the table to where Calem was in conversation with the Western delegation's head, a heavy-set man with a loud laugh and a sharp mind, who was clearly enjoying the debate they were in. Calem was not loud and did not laugh loudly, but he was leaning forward slightly, which was the version of engagement that meant he was genuinely interested, and she thought, I know that Tell already. 3 weeks, and I know that Tell. She looked away before he looked at her. The days continued. She learned the eastern path along the hill edge and walked it daily. She learned that the morning light in the north did not last long, and was best experienced immediately on waking, before it angled away. She learned that the cook's name was Harold, and he had strong opinions about the sourcing of root vegetables, which she found she respected. She learned that the court had a library with a reasonable legal collection and an extraordinary collection of natural history, and she spent most of her afternoons in it reading things she had never had access to. She learned that Calum came to dinner every night but ate quickly and left. She learned that on the 2 nights a week he did not have formal obligations. He stayed at the table longer, and that when he stayed longer the staff relaxed visibly. She learned that he had a younger sister named Ellie, who lived in the Southern Territories, and who sent letters that Calum answered immediately, the way Nessa answered letters. She was in the library on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the dinner, when a man she had not seen before came in and handed her an envelope and said it was from the Territory Legal Office, and that it had been flagged for her attention. She opened it. It was a legal summary. 3 pages, formal language, the kind that she had learned to read in the old compact, and which she moved through quickly, parsing the meaning from the structure. It was about Gerald. The Territory Legal Office, following the resolution of the bonding arrangement claim, had reviewed the administrative handling of the Ashvale Pax Omega registry filings over the past 8 years. The review had identified 14 months of gaps in the required territory reporting for registered Omegas under PAC care. It had additionally identified that the registration filing for one primary bloodline Omega, now under Northern Court protection, had been withheld from the Territory Registry for a period of 8 years beginning from the date of the original designation assessment. Withheld. Not lost, not delayed, withheld. She read the word and sat very still in the library with the document in her hands. Withheld meant known. It meant someone had known the filing existed and had chosen, actively, not to submit it. It meant the gap in the registry that Calum's office had flagged 14 months ago was not an accident or an administrative error. It was a decision. She thought about Gerald and his pale, annoyed eyes and his chair with arms and the coffee at the correct strength. She thought about 8 years of being kept without being considered, and she thought about the specific debt number that Nessa had mentioned, the significant number. And she thought about bride prices and arrangements and the word settled. She thought about what it meant that her registration had been withheld, what it meant for the legal protections she would have been entitled to, what it meant for the education provision the Territory Compact guaranteed to registered Omegas, which she had never received, and which she had read about in the library 2 weeks ago with a feeling she had not named. She set the document down on the table. She looked at the library, the high shelves and the old books and the afternoon light coming through the windows. She thought, I should be angry. She was not angry. She was past the place where anger at Gerald felt like a new thing. She had been surviving Gerald's choices for 8 years. The knowledge of the withheld filing was not a new wound. It was the clarification of an old one. The difference between not knowing and knowing was not the thing. The thing had already happened. Now she simply knew its precise shape. She picked the document back up and read it to the end. The Territory Legal Office was initiating a formal review of the Ashvale PAC's registry practices. For Gerald, as the responsible PAC authority representative, was named in the review. The review could result in sanctions, financial penalties, and the potential restructuring of PAC authority oversight. She read this several times. Then she folded the document and put it in the pocket of her borrowed coat, and walked out of the library and down the corridor and up the stairs, and knocked on the door of Calum's office. He opened it. He had a pen in his hand, which meant he had been writing, and he looked at her face, and the pen went still. Come in, he said. She came in, and he closed the door, and she took the document out of her pocket and held it out. He took it, and read it. She watched him read. His face did not change in the way most people's faces changed when they read something significant. He had the reading expression of a man who was receiving information and organizing it. Then he looked up at her. When did this arrive? He said. An hour ago, she said. I should have told you this was coming, he said. I knew the review was being initiated. I should have told you before you received the formal document. She looked at him. Yes, she said. You should have. I'm sorry, he said. She heard the apology. She looked at it carefully, the way she looked at everything he said, for the quality of it, whether it was performed or genuine, whether it was the kind of apology that was managing her, or the kind that was honest. It was the second kind. Was it obvious from the registry gap that the filing had been withheld, she said, when your office first flagged it? Not obviously, he said. It could have been administrative error. The review determined otherwise. Did you suspect it from the beginning, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I thought it was possible, he said, a gap of that length, for a primary bloodline, in a PAC with a competent authority representative. He stopped. Yes, I thought it was possible. She looked at him. You brought me here. she said, knowing there was a possibility that the situation was not just neglect but active. Yes, he said. And you didn't tell me because I wasn't certain, he said. And because you had enough to absorb, and because, he looked at her directly, because I thought telling you something I couldn't confirm yet would not help you and might make things harder. She thought about this. She thought about whether it was a reasonable decision. She thought about what she would have done differently if she had been in his position, managing information about a person in a difficult situation. She thought she might have made the same call, and she did not like the feeling of having been managed, even wisely, but she understood the reasoning. Don't do that again, she said. No, he said, I won't. She took the document back and put it in her pocket. She thought about Gerald's face when he heard about the territory review. She thought about the controlled expression, the pale eyes, the careful performance of unconcern. She thought about the chair with arms, and the coffee, and the 8 years of it. She thought about a filing that was withheld. I'm not going to do anything about Gerald, she said. That's not what I'm feeling. What are you feeling? He said. She thought about it honestly. Clarity, she said. I spent 8 years thinking there was something wrong with me. That I was being kept because I was difficult to place, because the dormant wolf, because the Omega designation, because there was something about me that required management. And now I know that the registry that would have shown the territory that I had rights and protections and an education entitlement was withheld from the moment it should have been filed. I was never difficult to place. I was placed very deliberately, in the most convenient position, by someone who had a reason. Calum said nothing. He let it sit. It changes the way I understand the past 8 years, she said. Yes, he said. I imagine it does. She looked at the window. The afternoon light was going. The valley below was getting dark early, because the winter was coming, and the days were shorter. I am going to walk the eastern path, she said. Yes, he said, and did not offer to come, which was exactly right. She walked the path in the cold and the growing dark, and she thought about clarity, and she thought about dormant wolves, and she thought about what it meant to have been deliberately kept in a position that someone else had built. She thought about the border pine on the Ashvale Hill. She thought about both hands flat on the bark. She thought about being 20 years old and standing in a kitchen and signing a line with her name pressed hard into the paper, hard enough to leave an indentation on the page below. She pressed her hands flat on the cold railing of the path and looked at the dark valley. Okay, she said, again, to herself, to the wolf, to the night. Then she went inside. The council session arrived in the 2nd month. Mara had been warned about it. Calum had told her 2 weeks before. The full Territorial Council will convene here in November, as it does every year. There will be 23 PAC representatives staying in the court for 5 days. There will be formal sessions in the morning and evening, and the afternoons will be more variable. It will be busy. What he had not said, or had said in language she had not translated correctly, was that the council's arrival changed the quality of the court in a way that was impossible to understand until it was happening. The building, which had accommodated her growing sense of it as a large and deliberate place that moved at its own pace, was suddenly full of people who moved at very different paces, voices in the corridors, staff doubled, formal meals every evening, and the particular quality of political attention that came into a building when the people inside it were negotiating things that mattered to them. She had learned to read this in the Ashvale compound. The compound's political events had been smaller, local, but the quality of attention was the same, a kind of awareness in the air, an alertness that was not hostile but was not comfortable either, the awareness of people who were in the same room for purposes that did not entirely align. She was 2 months in, and she knew the building well. She knew which corridors were quiet in the mornings and which were not, and where the library was relative to the formal session rooms, and how to get from her room to the east path without passing through the main entrance hall. She used all of this knowledge in the first 2 days of the council session to move through the building without being in anything she did not choose to be in. On the 3rd day, she chose to be in the morning session. Calum had not suggested it. She had decided on her own, in the library the afternoon before, while reading a section of the current Territorial Compact revision proposals that were on the council agenda. She had been reading them as private interest, the same way she had been reading the legal collection for 6 weeks. And then she had read a specific proposal, Section 12 of the Omega Rights Revision, and she had set the document down and thought for a long time. Section 12 proposed to raise the minimum age for formal bonding in all 5 territories from 18 to 21. It proposed to require an independent territory councillor to meet with any Omega party to a bonding arrangement and confirm that the arrangement was freely entered. It proposed to close several gaps in the registry process that allowed filings to be withheld or delayed by PAC authority representatives. She read it again. It was 3 paragraphs, and it was proposing to change things that would have changed everything for her, for a version of her that was 18, and in the first year of a situation she had had no tools to understand yet. She thought about 23 PAC representatives sitting in a session room debating whether those 3 paragraphs would be adopted, or revised, or removed from the proposal. She thought about the kinds of arguments that got made about things like this, the practical objections, and the authority objections, and the "this will create more problems than it solves" objections that were always made about proposals that protected categories of people who were not well represented in the room making the decisions. She went to the morning session. She sat at the back of the room, which was a large room set with long tables and a horseshoe. Calum was at the center of the horseshoe, which was where the presiding authority sat. The 23 PAC representatives were arranged around it. She chose a chair against the far wall, near the door, not at any table, just a chair. She did not announce herself. She simply sat down and the session began. The first 2 hours were procedural, and she listened carefully, and learned the room. She learned which representatives spoke often and which spoke rarely, and only when something mattered enough. She learned which alliances were visible in the body language of who sat where, and who looked at whom when certain things were said. She learned that 2 of the Western PACs were in a territorial dispute that was bleeding into every other topic. She learned that Calum presided the way he did everything, with the quality of stillness that was decision rather than absence, speaking when something needed to be said and not speaking when it didn't, which was rarer than it should have been in a room like this. At the midpoint, the session broke for tea and she did not move from her chair. Several representatives noticed her and looked, with the carefully calibrated looks of people who know they are looking at someone they should know who, and in what context, and are managing the fact that they don't. She did not introduce herself. She was not there to be introduced. She was there to listen. Calum, moving through the room during the break with the controlled ease of a person who is managing 23 different conversations, caught her eye once across the room. He did not come over. He did not make it into anything. He simply looked at her for a moment with the attentive quality she had learned, and then looked back at the person he was speaking with. When the session resumed, they reached Section 12 of the Omega Rights Revision. The representative from the Eastern Alliance raised the first objection within 30 seconds of the section being introduced. It was the practical objection. The current bonding age provisions were already being managed at the PAC level, and introducing a territory-wide standard would create administrative overlap. This was said in the tone of someone who had prepared the objection and was delivering it from memory. Mara listened. Another representative, from the Northern Auxiliary PAC, responded that the existing PAC-level management was clearly insufficient, given the rate of contested bonding arrangements coming through the Territory Legal Office in the past 3 years. There had been, she said, 47 contested arrangements in 3 years that had reached the territory level. 47 was not a large number in absolute terms. It was a very large number in terms of what each one of those cases meant for the person at the center of it. Mara thought about being at the center of one of those cases. She thought about what it had taken, what specific legal mechanism, what extraordinary coincidence of timing and authority, for her situation to resolve as it had. She thought about 46 other people who had not had that specific combination available to them. The debate moved across the room and she sat in her chair and listened. At a pause, a representative from the Western Central PAC said, "The proposal has merit in principle. The question is implementation, specifically the independent counselor provision. How is independence defined? Who selects the counselor? What are the appeal processes?" These were reasonable questions. They were also, she thought, the questions that would delay the proposal's adoption long enough for the momentum behind it to dissipate, which was a very old technique in rooms like this. She was not going to say anything. She had not come to say anything. She had come to listen. She said something. "Excuse me." The room turned to look at her. This was a unanimous turn. 23 people and their attendants, plus Calum, all of them registering the voice from the chair by the wall. She had a momentary awareness of what she was doing, which was standing up in a formal council session as someone with no official role in it, and she thought, this is either exactly right or completely wrong. Then she thought, I've been in rooms where I had no official role for 20 years. I know how to be useful in a room. The question about who selects the counselor is a fair one, she said. The proposal should address it clearly, but the selection process can be built after the principle is adopted. The risk of waiting for a perfect implementation before adopting the principle is that the implementation questions become the argument against the principle. Rather than the argument for a better version of it, silence. She was aware of Calum sitting at the center of the horseshoe. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the representative who had raised the implementation question. The principle matters, she said, because there are people in these territories right now for whom it is not an abstract policy discussion, and policy discussions that are not urgent to the people in the room are often urgent to the people not in the room. The representative who had raised the implementation question was a woman in her 50s named Representative Hargrove, who had the face of someone who had been in many rooms like this, and who was looking at Mara now with the particular attention of someone who has been said something true. "You are Mara of the Northern Court," Hargrove said. "Yes," Mara said. "Your situation was discussed in the legal review that accompanied this proposal," Hargrove said, not unkindly, factually. "I know," Mara said. "That's why I'm making the observation." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the document in front of her, and then she said, "I take the point about the distinction between principle and implementation." She was quiet for a second. "I withdraw the implementation objection as a reason to delay adoption. I maintain it as a reason to ensure the implementation is rigorous, which is a different thing." Mara sat back down in her chair. The room shifted. That small atmospheric shift of 23 people recalibrating something together. And the session moved forward. Afterward, when the session ended and the room began to empty, 3 representatives came to speak to her, not in a coordinated way, separately, as individuals, with the looks of people who had something specific they wanted to say. The first one said, "That was well put." The second one said, "I'd be interested in your perspective on Section 15 as well, if you're willing to be consulted." The third one, a very young man, probably 25, from one of the Eastern Pac territories, said, "I have a younger sister. Her situation is—" He stopped. "It is not your situation, but it is adjacent. I wanted you to know why I voted the way I voted." She looked at him. He had the face of someone who had come to a decision he was not sure would hold when he got back to his pack, and was looking for something to put in its place. "Keep going," she said, "when the vote reaches your pack council. Keep going." He nodded. He looked like he might say more, and then thought better of it and left. Calum came to her last. The room was emptying. The attendants were gathering documents. The light in the windows was that flat, bright winter light that gave nothing away. He stood near her chair and looked at her for a moment. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said. "No," she said. "Are you going to tell me when you're planning to speak next time?" he said. She looked at him. "Would you have advised me not to?" "No," he said. "Then it wouldn't have changed anything," she said, "and the session didn't need the interruption of you knowing in advance." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she had been getting better at reading, which was the expression of a person who has been surprised by something in a way that is not uncomfortable, the expression of a recalibration. "Hargrove pulled the implementation objection," he said. "I know. That objection has been blocking that proposal for 2 years, he said. She looked at the window. "It was a good objection, technically," she said. "It just wasn't being used to improve the proposal. It was being used to stop it." "Yes," he said. She stood. The room was almost empty now. The long tables and the arranged chairs and the horseshoe center where he had presided all morning. "I'm going to the library," she said. "I have 2 more sessions this afternoon," he said. "I know," she said. "You should go." He started toward the door and then stopped. He turned back. "Mara," he said. She looked at him. "You have been in this court for 2 months," he said. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer doesn't change anything about your situation here." She waited. "Are you happy?" he said. It was such a simple question, the same simple question he had asked her in the car, weeks ago. "Are you all right?" And she had said yes, which had been the self-managing answer, the correct level of information answer. She looked at him now and she thought about the honest answer. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I'm learning what the word means for me. I've been a long time in situations where the question wasn't available. I need more time with it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said gently. Meaning, "That's enough." Meaning, "That's a real answer and I'll keep it." "Go to your sessions," she said. He went. She stood in the empty session room for a moment longer. She looked at the long tables and the horseshoe center and the chairs where 23 people had been sitting, and she thought about the young man from the Eastern Pac and his younger sister, and the look on his face when she said, "Keep going." She thought about Section 12 and 3 paragraphs that were not abstract. She thought about a filing that had been withheld for 8 years, and about what it would have meant if those 3 paragraphs had been the law then. the independent counselor, the minimum age, the closed gaps in the registry. She thought about a version of herself at 18 who had a counselor who was not Gerald's appointment come and ask her, in a private room, away from the compound and the kitchen and the chair with arms, whether she had any preferences about her situation. She thought about what that version of herself would have said. She thought about how different the last 2 years alone might have been if the question had been asked. She went to the library. That evening at dinner, the table was full of the council representatives, and the conversation was political and detailed, and she sat in the middle of it and contributed when she had something to add, and did not when she didn't. And twice people spoke to her specifically, directed at her, not as a curiosity but as a participant. She was not used to being a participant, she was learning it. After dinner there was a gathering in the main sitting room that was informal, the kind of gathering that happened at the end of a long session day when people had been formal for too many hours. She went to it and stood near the fire for a while and listened to two representatives have an argument about territorial land use regulations that was interesting and technically detailed and had nothing to do with her. She was standing with a cup of tea, not thinking about anything in particular, when Representative Hargrove came to stand beside her. "I didn't pull the objection to be kind," Hargrove said. "I know," Mara said. "I pulled it because you were right," Hargrove said. "I've had that same objection in my back pocket for 2 years, and I told myself it was about implementation, and you said what I already knew, which was that it was about avoidance." Mara looked at the fire. "It's difficult," she said, "to see something clearly when you've been using it as a tool. The tool has to become uncomfortable first." Hargrove looked at her. "How did you know when to speak?" "In the session." "I didn't," Mara said. "I knew what I wanted to say, and I decided the discomfort of saying it was less than the discomfort of not saying it." Hargrove said, "That's a calculation most people get wrong." "I had a lot of practice with the wrong calculation," Mara said. "Getting it right felt like a correction." Hargrove made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been the sound of something landing properly. They stood by the fire in the gathered warmth of the room, and Mara thought about corrections. She thought about the way a small correction, made at the right moment, could change the direction of something large. She thought about 3 paragraphs in a proposal. She thought about the young man going home to his pack and keeping going. She thought about what it might mean to be good at this. The thought was new. She held it carefully. The way you hold something new, not too tight, not too loose. Good at this. She drank her tea and looked at the fire. January in the Northern Territories did not ask permission. It arrived the way things arrive when they have been preparing for a long time and are finally ready, with complete authority and no particular announcement. Mara woke one morning in the 7th week of the council session's aftermath, which had extended because of the revision process and 3 additional delegation visits, and the window was white. Not the pale gray white of northern cloud cover, which she had learned, but a flat reflective white that meant snow, actual snow, significant and committed. She got up and went to the window. The valley was gone. In its place was a consistent white that extended in every direction to the tree line, and then above the tree line to where the sky met it without a clear border. It was the most total weather she had ever seen. The Ashvale compound had snow in winter, but modest snow, the kind that acknowledged itself and then waited for you to acknowledge it back. This was different. This was snow that did not require acknowledgement. It simply was. She dressed and went downstairs and found that the court had already reorganized itself around the snow with the efficiency of a household that had done this many times. Additional wood was being brought in. Staff were checking the windows and doors. Clara was in the corridor with a list that she was moving through with her usual calm. "The path will be cleared by mid-morning," Clara told her. "Until then, I'd recommend the South Wing corridor for your walk." Mara said thank you and went to the South Wing corridor, which was long and had high windows on one side that looked out over the white grounds, and she walked it back and forth 3 times, while the sky stayed white, and the grounds stayed white, and the world outside stayed very still. She had been thinking about a particular thing for 4 days. It had started with a letter, not from Nessa this time, though Nessa's letters arrived weekly now, with a regularity that Mara found genuinely sustaining. This letter was from the Territory Legal Office, the second one, a follow-up to the first about the registry review. It informed her that the review of Gerald's handling of her registration filing was complete, and that the determination had been made that the filing had been withheld deliberately, not by error, and that sanctions were being applied. The sanctions were administrative and financial, and they did not require anything from her. She read the letter twice, and then set it on her desk and left her room, and walked the eastern path for an hour, even though it was cold. On her way back in, she had met Calum coming out, which was unusual, since he was typically in meetings in the morning. He had his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and he had looked at her face and said, "Bad news?" "The review is concluded," she said. "The determination is deliberate." He had looked at her for a moment. "Do you want to talk about it?" She thought about it. "Not today," she said. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She had gone back to her room and sat in the chair by the window and looked at the valley and thought about deliberate. It was a more final word than she had been carrying. She had known since the first document that the word was coming, but knowing it was coming and seeing it in official typeface on territory letterhead were two different calibrations. That evening at dinner she had been quiet, and Calum had not pushed. That was one of the things she had come to rely on about him, the not pushing. She had been with people her whole life who pushed, who filled silence with management, who treated her quietness as a problem to be fixed rather than a state to be respected. He treated her quietness as information and waited for whatever would come from it. What had come from it, over 4 days, was the particular thing she had been thinking about in the South Wing corridor in the white morning. She had been thinking about what she was going to do with the rest of the time she had here. She had been thinking about the 1 year the claim allowed, which was now at month 2.5, and what the remaining 9.5 months meant, and what happened at the end of them. She had been thinking about the young man from the Eastern Pack and his sister. She had been thinking about Section 12 and the 3 paragraphs. She had been thinking about the conversation with Hargrove and the phrase, "a calculation most people get wrong." She had been thinking about Calum at the center of the horseshoe and the way he presided, and about the meeting she had asked for in the 3rd week where she had told him she had too much space, and about him saying, "It's a slower process than anyone tells you." She had been thinking about the word willing. She had been using it privately, in her own mind, for 2 months. The way you use a word when you are testing it. Willing. If you are willing. If both parties are willing. She was willing. She was not ready to say it yet, or she had been not ready, and the snow outside the window on this particular morning was somehow the thing that made the not ready become ready, which she recognized as the kind of irrational truth that sometimes happened when you had been thinking carefully about something for a long time and a piece of weather interrupted the careful part. She stopped in the South Wing corridor. She stood at one of the high windows and looked out at the white grounds. She was willing. She was 20 years old and she was standing in a building that had been deliberate in its design, looking at a valley she had not known 2 months ago, and she had walked this corridor 3 times and thought about legal proposals and her pack and Gerald and the review, and the thing she kept coming back to, every time, was not any of those things. It was a conversation in a library, a man sitting across from her saying, "I want to know if this can be something. Not a legal arrangement, not a transaction, something real." She knew him now. She did not know all of him, but she knew him the way you know someone after 2 months of daily conversation and morning sessions and formal dinners and 1 or 2 evenings in the library, when neither of them had anything they needed to do, and they had read near each other without performing for the other. She knew his tells. She knew his gathering silences from his settled ones. She knew that he had a habit of touching the back of his neck with one hand when he was frustrated about something, and that he poured tea for other people before himself, always, not as a gesture but out of genuine habit, and that when he laughed, really laughed, it came out of him with a quality of surprise, as if he had not known the funny thing was going to be as funny as it was. She knew that he had not pushed her once in 2 months. She had been pushed her entire life, managed and arranged and placed, and he had simply not. She put her hand on the cold glass of the South Wing window the way she put her hands on cold surfaces when she needed to feel something clear and real. She thought about the border pine, while both hands flat on the bark, the cold, the honest quality of it. She thought about the wolf, choosing to wait. She thought about what the wolf had been waiting for, and she thought, for the first time with certainty rather than wondering, I think I might know. She walked out of the South Wing corridor and through the main hall and up the stairs, and she knocked on the door of Calum's office. He said, "Come in." She came in. He was at the desk with documents, where he usually was in the morning. He put the pen down when she came in. She sat in her usual chair. She looked at him for a moment. "The filing was deliberate," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've been carrying that for 4 days," she said. "I know," he said. "How are you carrying it now?" She thought about it. "Like a scar," she said, "not like a wound. The difference between those two has been the thing I've been figuring out." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what I want," she said, "what I actually want, not the correct level of information answer, not the managed version." He sat very still. "I want to be here," she said, "not because the alternative is worse, not because the legal situation makes it the sensible choice, because She stopped. She found the right sentence and tried again. Because when I walk the eastern path in the morning and look at the valley, I think, this is mine. I don't mean the land, I mean the feeling. The feeling of being somewhere that doesn't require me to manage myself into a shape I wasn't born in. He was looking at her with the careful attention that was not professional. And I'm aware, she said, that 2 months is not long, and that I don't know everything about you, and that the compact says 1 year, and it's only month 2. And I'm saying this now because the snow arrived this morning and I was walking the south wing corridor, and I realized that the not ready had become ready, and I don't know how to explain the snow in the corridor, but there it is. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the snow helped me make a decision once too. She looked at him. When? When I was 22, he said. The first winter after my father died. I was not handling the authority well. I went out in the first snow of the year and stood in it for a long time, and came back in and made 3 decisions I had been avoiding for months. He paused. I don't know what it is about snow. It's committed, she said. It doesn't do anything by half. Yes, he said. They looked at each other. Calum, she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the formal preceding context, not in a session, not in a reference to something, just the name, across a desk in a morning office. He said, yes. I want to complete the bonding, she said, not at the end of the year, not because the deadline is approaching. I want to do it because it's what I want. She looked at him steadily. If that's also what you want. He looked at her for a long time. Mara, he said. She waited. I have been. He stopped. He touched the back of his neck, the habit she knew, and then lowered his hand. I have been very careful for 2 months, he said, not to pressure, not to lean, not to use the situation to move things faster than you could move them with a clear mind. I know, she said. I want to be certain you know that this. He stopped again. She watched him find the honest version of it, the careful choosing words version, that what I feel about this situation, what I want from it, is not about the compact or the claim or the legal provision. It has not been about those things since the moment you walked down the aisle of that hall and turned to look at me. She thought about the hall, the stopping, the turning. She thought about the voice that had said, "What is your name?" She thought about, "If you are willing." You said if, she said. I know, he said. You didn't have to say if, she said. The legal mechanism was already complete. You could have just said, "You will come with me." Yes, he said. Why did you add it? He looked at her with the direct, honest eyes she had been cataloging for 2 months. Because the whole point, he said, was that you got to choose. She sat with that. She thought about choosing. She thought about the nature of a real choice, which required real options, which she had not had at the kitchen table or in the signing of the form or in the great hall of the Ashvale territory. She thought about the specific legal mechanism of the Compact of Kings and why it had been written, 300 years ago, by someone who had understood that an invocation of authority was only worth something if the person it was being applied to was given a genuine if. She thought about a man who had read files about her situation every 3 months and come on day 5 of 6, personally, in his own vehicle, to say if you are willing in front of 100 witnesses. Yes, she said. I know why you added it. And, he said. And, she said, I am willing. The window behind him was all white. The whole world outside reduced to one clean color. The fire in the fireplace had been going since early morning, and the room was warm. She could hear, distantly, the sound of the grounds crew clearing the eastern path. He stood and came around the desk, and she stood too, and they were standing in the room in the way they had stood in it many times, and it was also entirely different. He said her name again. She said, I know. They did not need a large ceremony. That was a thing she learned in the next days, that the Compact's bonding provision was one of the older legal instruments and operated outside the usual ceremony requirements. There were witnesses needed, a small number, and a territory registrar who came from the local office rather than from the Great Hall, and the formal seal that was the completion of the king's claim, and that was the whole of what was required by law. What they chose, in addition to what was required by law, was a dinner, just the court's regular dinner, on a Thursday evening, with Clara and Petra and Harold from the kitchen, and the 4 senior staff, and Calum's sister Ellie, who had arrived 2 days before, and who was 24, and had the same directness her brother had, but applied with considerably more expressiveness, and who had introduced herself to Mara by saying, I read about the ceremony. I want you to know I would have found a way to stop it myself if he hadn't gotten there first. Mara had looked at her and thought, I believe that completely. Ellie sat on Mara's left at the dinner, and Calum sat on her right, and the registrar had come that afternoon. And the formal seal was applied, and the documentation was signed, and Mara had pressed her name hard into the paper with good penmanship, the way she always signed things that mattered. Harold had made an extraordinary dinner, not elaborate exactly, but the kind of dinner that has been made with full attention, the kind that shows in every course that someone wanted it to be very good. After dinner, in the sitting room by the fire, Ellie told Mara something she had not known. "He called me the night he read the file," Ellie said. "The night after the arrangement was registered. It was very late. He doesn't usually call that late." Mara looked at her. "What did he say?" "He said he had read a file about someone," Ellie said. "And he described what was in it, and he asked me what I thought." She paused. "He doesn't ask that often. When he does, it means something." "What did you tell him?" Mara said. "I told him what you would have told him," Ellie said, which was that the question wasn't what he thought about it, the question was what he was going to do about it. Mara looked at the fire. "And then he did something about it," Ellie said. "On day 5 of 6, Mara said. Ellie looked at her. "You know about the timeline." "I worked it out," Mara said. Ellie was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He doesn't do things slowly when they matter to him. He waits until he's certain, and then he moves. He's been that way since he was 12. Mara thought about this. She thought about the quality of certainty that moved a person on day 5 of 6. She thought about what it meant to be the thing someone was certain about. She thought about her wolf, choosing to wait. She pressed her hand against the arm of the chair and thought, okay. It was there. She could feel it. For the first time, not dormant, not waiting, but present, the way something long asleep wakes slowly and fully and is startled by its own existence. She kept her face still. Later, when the evening was winding down and Ellie had gone to bed and the staff had gradually retreated, Mara sat by the fire with Calum, and the building settled around them the way old buildings settle. And she said, "Ellie told me about the call." He looked at her. "I assumed she would." "You assumed she would tell me and you didn't tell me yourself," she said. "It seemed like something she should tell you," he said. "I'm not good at." He stopped. "At the personal version of things. I'm better in writing." "You were good at it in the session room," she said, "when you said if you are willing." "That was a sentence I had prepared," he said. She looked at him. "How long before the ceremony did you prepare it?" He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "The drive over." She thought about the 2-hour drive to the Ashvale Great Hall. She thought about a man in the back of a vehicle composing a sentence for 2 hours. "If you are willing." "It was a good sentence," she said. "It was 4 words," he said. "4 words can be enough," she said. "Sometimes 4 words are exactly enough." He looked at her. Outside, the snow was still there, committed to itself in the way it had been since morning. The fire was low but still warm. The building was quiet. She was in a building she had learned room by room, path by path, window by window. She was in a building that had become, in a specific and real sense, hers, not by inheritance or arrangement or obligation, but by the accumulation of days in which she had been allowed to simply be in it, making her own measurements. She thought about the wolf that had been choosing to wait. She thought, I wonder if it knew all along what it was waiting for, or if it was waiting simply because the thing worth waiting for had not yet arrived, and it was too smart to settle for what was available before then. She thought, I think it was smart enough. She looked at the fire, and the warm room, and the man she was learning. In the way you learn someone, you have decided you will have time to learn fully. And she thought, this is mine, not the building, not the title, or the legal provision. This, the choice. The feeling of having made a choice that was entirely her own, from a place of clarity and not pressure, because she wanted to and not because the alternative was worse. That was hers. She had been waiting for it for 20 years. She was not waiting anymore. The wolf came on a Tuesday. Mara had learned, in the weeks since the bonding, that the Northern Court had its own pace for ordinary days, a rhythm different from the compound's kitchen schedule, but with its own reliable shape. Mornings belonged to Calum's administrative work, which she had started attending regularly, sitting in on the briefings from the territory wardens and the legal summaries from his senior staff, learning the texture of decisions made at scale. Afternoons she spent in the library or on the Eastern Path or in the working sessions that had grown from her appearance at the council meeting, which had produced, without her planning for it, a standing invitation to the Omega Rights Revision Committee that she attended every other week. She had been working on the language of Section 12 for 3 weeks. The implementation questions that Hargrove had raised were real questions, and she had been going through the compact's existing counselor provisions and the territory legal precedents in building, carefully and without rushing, a framework for the independent counselor mechanism that addressed the objections without softening the provision. It was the most sustained work she had ever done, not because it was the hardest, in terms of complexity, but because it was the first time she had worked on something for herself, in the sense that it had been chosen rather than assigned, and the choice made every hour of it feel different from the 8 years of managed competence in the Ashvale kitchen. She had written to Nessa about it. Nessa had written back, "I always knew you were wasted on the carrots. The carrots were fine, but they were not going to change anything. This might." The Tuesday morning was unremarkable. It was the kind of winter morning that was cold and very clear, and that had a quality of brightness without warmth, the light hard and specific. She had breakfast in the East Hall with Ellie, who was staying through the end of the month, and they talked about a book Ellie had brought and about the Eastern PAC delegation that was arriving the following week, and about whether Harold's opinion about root vegetables had improved since Mara had started providing her own sourcing recommendations, which it had, though Harold had accepted the improvement without acknowledging the source, which Mara found genuinely funny. Ellie made her laugh. This was one of the things she had not expected about Ellie, the specific quality of her humor, which was quick and dry and aimed exactly at the true thing in a situation, the thing everyone in the room was thinking and not saying. Mara had spent 20 years not saying things, and she found, in Ellie's company, that the not saying things came apart easily, which was both unexpected and welcome. After breakfast, she went to the garden. The garden in the winter was not a garden in any living sense. It was a structured space with raised beds and paths and the bare architecture of the thing that would be a garden when the season permitted it. The frost had made a fine white edge on every surface, and her breath came out in small clouds, and the cold was the committed kind, the kind that meant it. She liked the garden in winter. She had found in the past weeks that she liked things stripped of their ornament, their bare forms, trees without leaves, garden beds without planting, buildings in their stone before the light dressed them. I was learning about herself, a person who preferred the underlying structure of things. She was walking the path between the raised beds when it happened. There was no warning in the way she had expected warning, which she had always imagined as a gradual thing, a slow gathering, like the kettle with its low hiss and tick before the boil. It was not gradual. It was an arrival, the way snow arrived in the north, committed and total. She stopped walking. The cold air was on her face, and the frost was on the bare branches, and the garden was very quiet, and the feeling was not exactly pain and not exactly pressure. It was something in between, something enormous arriving from inside her and pressing outward against every border she had, and she sat down. She sat down on the cold path because her legs had made the decision before she did. She put both hands flat on the cold stone of the path. The wolf came. It did not announce itself. It simply came. The way things that have been waiting a long time come when they are finally ready, with complete authority and no hesitation, and she sat on the cold stone path in the winter garden and shook with it, the arrival of it, the size of it, the extraordinary fact of it. She had been told by the healer at 14 that her wolf would come in time. She had been told at 17 that it was present and choosing. She had been told these things and she had waited for them, and eventually, in the long, careful management of her own survival, she had stopped actively waiting and had simply carried the knowledge the way you carry something that has no immediate use, carefully, against the day. The wolf was silver gray. She could not see it in the way you see something outside yourself. She felt it the way you feel a limb you forgot you had, the sudden full awareness of something that was always part of you, and had been waiting for you to stop moving past it and stand still long enough to find it. Silver gray, her mother's colors. She sat on the cold path with her hands flat on the stone, and breathed slowly, and the garden was very quiet, and the wolf was present, and she thought, I know you. She did not know how long she sat there. The cold worked through her coat and into her hands, and she did not move because moving would have required ending something she was not ready to end yet. She sat in the full experience of it, the wolf present and the garden still, and the winter air clean and cold and the light hard and specific on every surface. The wolf did not leave. This was what she had not understood before, perhaps what everyone who did not have a wolf misunderstood. It did not come and go like a mood. It was simply present, the way a part of yourself is present when you have finally stopped ignoring it. She sat on the cold path until she became aware of footsteps. She had not called for anyone. She had not been able to move to call for anyone, and had not wanted to. But the steps on the garden path were familiar before she heard them properly. The specific pace of someone who moves with decision and does not rush. Nukalim came around the corner of the garden path and stopped. He had his coat on. He looked at her, sitting on the cold stone path with her hands flat in front of her, and she looked up at him, and whatever was in her face was apparently information enough. He sat down, not standing over her with concern, not reaching immediately to help her up. He sat down on the path beside her, in his coat, on the cold stone, the way you sit down with someone who needs the presence and not the intervention. They sat on the path together and the winter garden was quiet. After a while she said, "It came." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You knew before I said it?" "Your face," he said. She thought about what her face must look like. She thought about the feeling in her chest, which was not the caged thing she had carried for 8 years, not the alarm system that breathed quietly in there through all the years of management and survival. It was different. It was larger, and it was warmer, and it was her. "My mother's colors," she said. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "You knew from the file," she said. "The healer's note," he said. It described the bloodline markers. Silver gray was noted. She sat with the cold stone under her hands and the wolf present and steady inside her, and the man beside her on the path. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Yes," he said. "The healer's note said the wolf was choosing to wait," she said. "You told me that months ago, and I have been thinking about it ever since, trying to understand what it was waiting for." He said nothing. He was in the gathered silence. "I think it was waiting for this," she said. "Not this specifically. Not the court, or the circumstances, or the legal mechanism, but what this is, which is," she looked for the right sentence, she found it, "the condition of being allowed to be the thing I actually am, without being managed into a shape that was convenient for someone else." She looked at him. "It was waiting for permission," she said. "Not from you, not from the compact, from me. I had to stop managing myself into a smaller version, and the wolf was waiting for me to do that." He looked at her with the careful expression that was not professional. "And have you?" he said. Stopped. She thought about the kitchen cot and the serving face and the specific strength of the coffee and 8 years of not being asked. She thought about the corridor and the sessions and the committee and the library and the eastern path and the eastern path and the eastern path, all the time she had walked it and felt the valley below her and thought, "This is mine." She thought about the border pine, both hands flat on the bark. "Okay. Yes," she said. "I think I have." He said nothing. He let it be true. After a while the cold reached the degree that required acknowledging, and she said she thought they should go inside, and he stood and extended his hand to help her up and she took it, which was a simple ordinary thing and also not ordinary at all, and they walked in from the garden together. In the days that followed, the wolf's arrival moved through the court the way important things move through a household that has been waiting for something, quietly, with a particular quality of warmth, the way a cold building warms when someone lights the right fire. Petra, who brought her morning tea, said nothing for a week, because Petra had learned her, and then one morning said, "It shows, if you don't mind my saying, something is different." Mara said she didn't mind. Petra said, "It's good," and left it at that, which was exactly right. Clara, who managed everything, said nothing at all, which was also exactly right. But she had the look of someone who had been waiting to see how something turned out, and was satisfied with what she saw. Ellie said, "Finally," and then, "I didn't mean that the way it sounded," and then, "Actually I did mean it that way," and Mara said, "I know," and Ellie said, "Good." The Territory Legal Office sent a formal notification about the completion of the bonding that required signatures and registration documents, and Mara signed them all with the same careful penmanship she brought to everything she signed now, pressing the pen into the paper the way she had pressed her hands flat on the cold stone and on the glass, and on the bark of the border pine on the Ashvale Hill, with the full weight of intention. She wrote to Nessa, "The wolf came. I cannot fully describe it, so I will say this. I understand now what you said about your brother leaving, and the way you cried, for exactly 30 seconds, and then stood up and splashed your face, and went back to work. The grief and the relief and the love all in the same 30 seconds. I had something like that, but in the middle of a winter garden, and it was not 30 seconds, it was longer, and Calum sat on the cold path with me without being asked or explained, and I think that is the truest thing I know about why this is the right thing." Nessa wrote back, 30 seconds is my limit. Yours sounds better. Also, I'm coming to visit in the spring. I need to see the valley. Betty says it's extraordinary. I told Betty you weren't friends, but I think we need to reassess." Mara laughed when she read that. Actually laughed, which she had been doing more of since the wolf arrived. The way a door you have been keeping barely ajar is finally opened and the room fills with the temperature it was always meant to be. The Omega Rights revision passed in its full form in March. Not because of any single person. Revisions of that scope passed because of accumulated pressure and shifting argument, and the slow work of many people building a case for something that was right, and waiting for enough of the room to agree at the same time. But Section 12 passed with the independent counselor provision intact, and with the implementation mechanism that Mara had spent 6 weeks developing through the committee. And Hargrove presented the final text and said, in the session, that the implementation framework was the work of several contributors, and then read a list, and Mara's name was on it, and she sat in her chair at the back of the room, and felt the specific feeling of hearing your name read on a list of people who did something real. It was different from having her name on a registration form, different from having it on a bonding arrangement document, different from having it in the territory file that had been withheld for 8 years. It was her name attached to something she had built. She looked at her hands on her knees and thought about the carrots and the kitchen cot and Nessa's letter and the wolf that had been choosing to wait, and she thought, all right, it was all worth it. Not in the way that suffering is worth it when it builds character, which is a sentence she did not believe, but in the way that all the years of careful management and not being asked, and surviving what was in front of her, had not broken the part of her that could do this. It was still there. It had always been there. It had been waiting, the same way the wolf had been waiting. For the right conditions. She had made the right conditions. That, she thought, was the only story she wanted to tell about the years in the compound, not the story of what was done to her. That story was true, but it was not the whole of the truth. The whole of the truth included what she had done with it, which was refuse, very quietly and very consistently, to be reduced by it, to keep the part of herself that could think and assess and move and choose, even when choosing was not available to her. Even when the choosing was only the small internal kind, the kind that kept her intact for the larger choices that were coming. She had not known they were coming. She had just kept the part of herself that could make them alive. In April, when the valley below the court was beginning to turn green, and the trees were doing the slow work of beginning again, Mara walked the eastern path in the morning, and stood at the railing and looked at the valley, and the sky above it, and breathed the spring air, which was cold still, but with a different quality of cold. A cold that was already preparing to become something else. She pressed her hands on the railing. She thought about the border pine on the Ashvale Hill. She thought about both hands flat on the bark in the dark of the night before the ceremony and, okay. She thought about the walk back down the hill and the compound gate and the kitchen building and the cot and the dress on the shelf. She thought about getting into the car in the morning and watching the compound fall behind the window and seeing the seal on the large black vehicles in the lane. She thought about standing in the middle of a stone hall in an ivory dress and hearing a voice she had never heard before say, "This ceremony will stop." She thought about, "What is your name?" She thought about, "If you are willing." She stood at the railing in the spring morning and she looked at the valley below and she thought about her mother's wolf, silver gray and extraordinary, running through the forest with no one's permission and no one's arrangement and no one's idea of what she was supposed to be. She thought about her own wolf, present and steady and silver gray, and hers. She had walked up a hill in the dark once, the night before a ceremony she had not chosen, and stood at a border tree with both hands flat on the bark and said, to the tree and to herself, and to the wolf she could not feel yet, okay. She was standing on a path above a valley she had learned to call hers, with the spring coming up from the trees below and the sky clear and open above, and she was not afraid, and she was not managed, and she was not kept. She was here because she had chosen to be here. She put both hands flat on the railing. The morning was cold and clear and honest, and she breathed it in. Okay, she said, not a bracing for something, not a stealing. The okay of someone who has arrived at the place they were making their way toward without knowing they were making their way toward it. The okay of a beginning. The valley stretched below her, green at the edges now, the winter giving up its hold in the way the north always eventually gave up its hold. Without apology but without insistence either, simply moving aside for what was next. She stood and breathed and looked at it, and the morning went on around her, unhurried and complete.